Hello everyone, I am the Crime Teller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. New Zealand, a land known for its breathtaking landscapes and peaceful communities, has seen relatively few major criminal cases compared to other nations. However, among the darkest events in its history, one case stands out as a chilling reminder that even the safest places can harbor hidden dangers. This is the story of Michael Callaway, a name that once belonged to a respected businessman, but later became infamous as the mastermind behind one of the largest financial crimes in New Zealand's history. Michael Callaway was a man who, on the surface, appeared to embody success. Born in 1967 in Auckland, he was the son of a well-known real estate developer. His father's influence allowed him to attend the best schools, travel the world, and network with the elite. By the time he reached his early 30s, he had already built a name for himself in the financial sector. He founded Callaway Investment Group, an enterprise that promised high returns through smart investments. His clients ranged from ordinary citizens hoping to secure their retirement to large corporations seeking strategic growth. His reputation for delivering consistent profits made him one of the most trusted financial figures in the country. But behind the polished image, Michael harbored a secret. He was not the financial genius people believed him to be. Instead of making legitimate investments, he was running what would later be revealed as one of the most sophisticated Ponzi schemes in New Zealand's history. He used new investors' money to pay off earlier clients, creating the illusion of success. As long as more money kept coming in, the scheme could continue. For nearly 15 years, he managed to avoid detection, growing his empire into a multi-billion-dollar operation. His lifestyle reflected his unchecked greed. He owned multiple luxury properties, drove expensive cars, and was frequently seen at exclusive social events. His ability to blend in with the elite made him untouchable in the eyes of law enforcement. He was generous in his philanthropy, donating millions to charities, funding scholarships, and even supporting public infrastructure projects. This further solidified his image as a selfless businessman, masking the true nature of his operations. Everything changed in 2013 when an economic downturn began exposing the cracks in his empire. Investors started requesting withdrawals en masse, expecting the same high returns they had been promised. The problem was there were no real profits, only an intricate web of transactions designed to cover up losses. As the pressure mounted, financial regulators began scrutinizing Callaway Investment Group more closely. Some employees, noticing irregularities in financial records, began to suspect fraud. Whispers spread through the industry, leading to increased media attention. The moment of reckoning came in early 2014 when a whistleblower, one of Callaway's former financial analysts, came forward with damning evidence. Leaked internal documents revealed that the firm had been fabricating profits for years. The authorities wasted no time. In a dramatic raid, law enforcement stormed Callaway's main office in Wellington. The once unshakable businessman was arrested on charges of fraud, money laundering, and financial deception. As investigators peeled back the layers of deception, the true scale of the crime became evident. Over 15,000 investors had lost their life savings, with losses estimated at over NZD 3.5 billion. Many victims were retirees who had placed their trust in Callaway, believing his promises of financial security. The fallout was devastating, with families losing homes, businesses collapsing, and lives shattered. During the trial, Callaway showed little remorse. He maintained that his business model had simply collapsed due to unforeseen market forces, refusing to acknowledge that it was fraudulent from the start. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, leaked emails, and testimonies from former employees painted a clear picture of deliberate deception. The court found him guilty on multiple counts, sentencing him to 30 years in prison, the harshest financial crime sentence in New Zealand's history. The case left a deep scar on the country's financial landscape. It led to sweeping regulatory changes, ensuring stricter oversight of investment firms. But for the victims, no amount of reform could undo the damage. Many never recovered from their losses, forced to rebuild their lives from nothing. Callaway's name became synonymous with betrayal, a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition and the price of greed. Even behind bars, he remained defiant. Reports from prison indicated that he continued to see himself as a victim of circumstance, a fallen entrepreneur rather than a criminal. But for the thousands who suffered because of his actions, he would always be remembered as the man who shattered their trust in the pursuit of wealth. Michael Callaway sat in his penthouse office, staring at the Auckland skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the city. His empire stood tall, glass buildings bearing his name, accounts filled with millions, a lifestyle envied by many. But beneath the polished exterior of Callaway Investment Group lay a fragile foundation, a house of cards built on deceit. For 15 years, he had played the game masterfully, manipulating numbers, shifting funds, ensuring that no one could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The financial world had hailed him as a genius, a man with an uncanny ability to turn even the most modest investments into fortune. Yet deep down, he knew that fortune was a mirage, an illusion crafted by the movement of money rather than the generation of real wealth. It had begun as an accident, a small deception to cover a poor investment choice. A single bad trade, hidden in the books, justified as a temporary setback. But the market had been unforgiving, and soon, one lie had required another. Before long, he found himself orchestrating an intricate web of transactions, robbing Peter to pay Paul, ensuring that withdrawals were covered by new investments rather than actual returns. His clients saw only success, their accounts showing numbers that climbed month after month. Few questioned the magic behind it, blinded by the promise of prosperity. Even those who had suspicions kept silent, unwilling to disrupt a system that, on the surface, appeared to be working. Wealth had bought him power, and power had shielded him. Government officials attended his gala events, shaking his hand, thanking him for his generous donations to public causes. He was a man who seemed to give more than he took, funding scholarships for underprivileged students, backing initiatives for economic growth. Every action was calculated, every move designed to solidify his position. If doubts ever arose, they were quickly drowned in a flood of philanthropy and influence. But as the years passed, the weight of his deception grew heavier. Keeping the illusion alive required ever larger sums of money, and the appetite of his investors was insatiable. Then came the market downturn of 2013. It was nothing catastrophic, certainly not the kind of crash that should have toppled a well-run firm. But for Callaway, it was an earthquake. Investors, spooked by the sudden economic uncertainty, began demanding withdrawals. Not all at once, not in a panic, but in steady waves that sent tremors through his empire. He had enough reserves to cover the first round, and the second, but by the third, the numbers no longer aligned. His usual tricks, shuffling money between accounts, delaying payouts with bureaucratic excuses, were no longer enough. The pressure mounted with each passing week. His top executives began to notice discrepancies. Some were longtime loyalists who had reaped the benefits of Callaway's success, turning a blind eye to small irregularities. But others were younger, sharp-eyed professionals who had joined in recent years, eager to prove their worth. One in particular, Daniel MacArthur, a financial analyst fresh out of university, had been quietly piecing together inconsistencies. He had no intention of exposing his boss at first. In fact, he admired Callaway, his confidence, his brilliance, the effortless way he navigated high-stakes finance. But numbers didn't lie, and the deeper Daniel dug, the more he realized something was very wrong. In late 2013, Daniel submitted a confidential report to the Internal Compliance Department. The document outlined anomalies in fund transfers, inconsistencies in reported earnings, and unexplained gaps in the firm's financial statements. The compliance team, reluctant to challenge the man who had built the company, dismissed his concerns, insisting that Callaway himself had likely approved the irregularities for strategic reasons. But Daniel wasn't satisfied. He started keeping records, copying files, gathering evidence. And in early 2014, he made the decision that would change everything. He contacted a journalist. The exposé that followed sent shockwaves through New Zealand's financial sector. It was released in a high-profile investigative report, featuring leaked documents, insider testimony, and a scathing analysis of Callaway's fraudulent operations. The public, who had once viewed him as a financial savior, now saw him as a villain. Panic spread among investors. Hundreds flooded Callaway Investment Group's offices, demanding their money. But the accounts were empty. The withdrawals had been covered by new deposits for years, and now that the trust was broken, the entire system collapsed like a dam giving way under pressure. Law enforcement moved swiftly. A warrant was issued for Callaway's arrest, and in a dramatic sequence captured by news cameras, he was taken into custody outside his estate. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. The man who had once held the financial world in his grasp now stood in handcuffs, facing the consequences of his empire built on lies. As investigators dug into the company's records, the full scale of the fraud became clear. Over 15,000 victims, billions of dollars lost, retirement funds drained, family savings wiped out. Some victims were elderly couples who had entrusted their life savings to Callaway, believing they were securing their future. Others were young professionals, drawn in by the promise of financial freedom. The human cost was devastating. In the months that followed, stories emerged of ruined lives. Families forced to sell their homes, businesses collapsing, dreams shattered. At his trial, Callaway remained composed. He wore the same expensive suits, carried himself with the same confidence, as if he were merely attending another business meeting. He refused to acknowledge his guilt, claiming that his firm had been a victim of economic instability rather than outright fraud. But the evidence was undeniable. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a picture of a man who had knowingly and deliberately orchestrated a scheme of unprecedented scale. Former employees testified against him, their voices filled with regret. Some admitted they had suspected wrongdoing, but had been too afraid to speak out. Others confessed to being complicit, assisting in fabricating reports, shifting funds, maintaining the illusion. The judge's ruling was swift and severe. 30 years in prison, the harshest financial crime sentence in New Zealand's history. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and outrage. Some victims felt justice had been served. Others believed no sentence could undo the damage he had caused. As Callaway was led away in chains, the man who had once stood atop New Zealand's financial world now faced a future of concrete walls and steel bars. The aftermath of the case reshaped the financial industry. Stricter regulations were introduced, oversight was increased, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent such a scheme from ever happening again. But for many, the wounds remained. Some victims never recovered financially, forced to rebuild their lives from the ground up. Others carried the emotional scars of betrayal, struggling to trust financial institutions ever again. As for Michael Callaway, he faded into obscurity. Occasionally, his name would resurface in news reports about financial fraud, a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. In prison, he was just another inmate, stripped of the power and prestige he had once wielded. Those who had once admired him now spoke his name with bitterness, a reminder of the dangers of greed and the high cost of deception. And so his story became a lesson, a warning that even the most powerful can fall, that wealth built on lies will eventually crumble. The towers that bore his name were sold, his assets liquidated, his legacy erased. In the end, all that remained was the memory of a man who had promised fortune but delivered ruin, a shadow cast over New Zealand's financial history, never to be forgotten. The months following Michael Callaway's conviction were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, asset liquidations, and endless media coverage dissecting every aspect of his downfall. His properties, sprawling estates with oceanfront views, penthouse apartments in Auckland's most elite districts, private villas in Queenstown, were all seized and auctioned off, the funds distributed in a futile attempt to repay the victims. But the numbers didn't add up. The money was gone, funneled through offshore accounts, lost in risky trades, or simply spent in ways that would never be recovered. For many, the meager restitution they received was a cruel joke, pennies compared to the life savings they had entrusted to him. But beyond the financial wreckage, there was something deeper, a collective sense of betrayal, a fracture in the country's trust. Callaway hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen futures, shattered dreams, and rewritten the stories of thousands of people who had believed in him. Retirees who had once planned to travel the world now faced the prospect of working into their 70s. Families who had hoped to buy homes for their children now found themselves scraping to get by. Charities he had once lavished with donations now questioned whether they had unknowingly been complicit in laundering stolen wealth. The media, relentless in their pursuit of every angle, kept the story alive long after Callaway's sentencing. Documentaries aired, analyzing the rise and fall of his empire. Investigative journalists tracked down former employees, investors, and even Callaway's distant relatives, searching for some insight into how a man who had once been a pillar of the community had become New Zealand's most notorious financial criminal. Some painted him as a calculating villain, devoid of remorse. Others, particularly those who had worked closely with him, described a man who had started with good intentions, but had been consumed by the weight of his own deception. In prison, Callaway remained an enigma. He did not grant interviews, did not write letters, did not attempt to appeal his conviction. For the first time in his life, he was powerless, and no amount of financial expertise or boardroom strategy could change his fate. Prison was a world foreign to him, stripped of the luxuries he had once taken for granted. The stark, windowless walls of his cell were a far cry from the floor-to-ceiling glass that had once framed his city views. The rigid schedules, the impersonal uniforms, the constant scrutiny, these were things he had never experienced before. At first, he carried himself with the same quiet arrogance that had once defined him, expecting deference, believing that even here, in this place, he could maintain some measure of control. But prison had no room for men like Michael Calloway. Here, wealth meant nothing. Status meant nothing. He was just another inmate, another number, another story whispered among the guards and prisoners. The first few weeks were a shock to his system. He had never known what it meant to wait in line for food, to be locked away at night with nothing but the sound of breathing from the other cells. He had never been spoken to with disdain, never been treated as if he were insignificant. It wasn't long before the reality of his situation set in. The once proud tycoon, who had walked through the halls of financial institutions with confidence, now walked the prison corridors with his head slightly lower, his shoulders less squared. The arrogance that had once been his shield eroded under the weight of his new existence. He tried, at first, to maintain a sense of routine. He read books, legal textbooks, economic analyses, anything to keep his mind occupied. He worked out, attempting to preserve the image of control. But none of it could change what had already been done. Time moved differently behind bars. The outside world continued on without him, reshaping itself around the crater he had left behind. New financial regulations were introduced, named after his crimes, ensuring that no one could replicate what he had done. Former associates distanced themselves, erasing him from their public statements, pretending they had never truly known him. Even the charities he had once supported quietly removed his name from their donor lists, unwilling to be associated with a man whose generosity had been built on theft. Meanwhile, his victims fought to rebuild their lives. Some, driven by a need for justice, dedicated themselves to financial reform, becoming advocates for greater transparency in investment firms. Others struggled in silence, too ashamed to admit that they had been deceived, retreating into quiet suffering. A few, those who had lost everything, never recovered at all. Stories surfaced of elderly couples forced into public housing, of once successful entrepreneurs now working minimum wage jobs just to survive. The human cost of Calloway's actions could not be measured in numbers alone. Years passed. The world forgot Michael Calloway, except in financial textbooks and cautionary tales. He became a ghost, his name spoken only in classrooms dissecting financial fraud, in courtrooms prosecuting new cases, in whispered conversations among those who had once known him. His empire was gone, his wealth scattered, his legacy tarnished beyond repair. Inside the prison walls, he remained, no longer the master of deception, no longer the man who could bend the market to his will. Just another prisoner, counting the days, watching as the world moved on without him. The years inside passed in a slow, suffocating rhythm, each day blending into the next, marked only by the small, repetitive rituals of prison life. The clatter of metal trays at mealtime, the distant echoes of footsteps in the corridors, the occasional outbursts from other inmates breaking the monotony. This was all that remained of Michael Calloway's world. The once celebrated financial mastermind, who had commanded boardrooms and dictated market movements with a mere nod, now lived in a space barely bigger than his former walk-in closets. He had stopped counting the days. At first, he had tried to keep track, marking them in his mind, telling himself that each passing week, each passing year, brought him closer to something, perhaps redemption, perhaps freedom. But time in prison had a way of erasing those illusions. There was no future here, no carefully laid out plans, no strategies to maneuver his way out. His power had been stripped away the moment the prison gates had slammed shut behind him. The media had long since moved on. The world had new scandals, new financial crimes to dissect, new villains to hate. Occasionally, his name resurfaced in an article, usually as a reference point in discussions about regulatory failures or in retrospectives about the greatest fraudsters in history. His image, a stark contrast to the suave, confident figure he had once projected, was sometimes dredged up, showing the inevitable toll of prison life. His sharp features had softened. His posture no longer carried the effortless arrogance it once had. He was just another inmate, another fallen titan, who had learned that even the highest walls of wealth could crumble. The letters had stopped coming. At first, there had been a flood, some from former investors, demanding explanations, demanding justice, demanding answers he would never be able to give. Others had come from journalists, offering him the chance to tell his story, to share his side of things. There had even been a handful of letters from those who still believed in him, who saw him as a tragic figure rather than a criminal. But over time, they all faded. No one wrote to him anymore. No one cared what Michael Calloway thought or felt. The only reminders of his past life were the occasional books sent by a prison librarian who seemed to take pity on him. They weren't the financial analyses or economic journals he once devoured, but instead novels, stories of downfall and redemption, of men who had built empires only to lose them. He read them at first with disinterest, then with quiet resignation. There was something poetic about it, he supposed, that he now spent his days consuming the very narratives he had once dismissed as fiction. But even literature couldn't drown out the memories. Late at night, when the prison was silent, he would find himself haunted by the echoes of the past. The sound of applause in the conference halls, the murmurs of admiration from those who had hung on his every word, the intoxicating rush of power when he had stood atop his empire, untouchable, invincible. And then, the moment it had all come crashing down, the gavel slamming, the judge's voice sealing his fate, the cold steel of the handcuffs locking around his wrists. Regret had a way of creeping in during the quiet hours, not just for what he had done, but for the lies he had told himself along the way. There had been a time when he truly believed he was untouchable, that he could keep the illusion going forever, that he could outmaneuver anyone who dared to question him. He had convinced himself that he was different from the others, that he was smarter, more capable, that the rules did not apply to him. But in the end, the rules had caught up. They always did. The world outside continued without him, reshaping itself in ways he would never fully understand. The financial sector, once his playground, had moved forward, new names rising to replace his, new strategies evolving in response to the loopholes he had exploited. His former colleagues had distanced themselves, reinventing their careers, rewriting their histories to erase any trace of their association with him. And then there were the victims, people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by his actions. He often wondered about them in the dead of night. The retirees who had lost everything, the families who had been forced to start over, the students who had watched their education funds disappear. Did they still curse his name? Did they still dream of justice, of revenge? Or had they too moved on, leaving him behind in the past where he belonged? He would never know. And perhaps that was the greatest punishment of all. Not the prison walls, not the loss of wealth or power, but the knowledge that, in the end, he had become nothing more than a cautionary tale, a name whispered in finance classes, a story told to warn others of the dangers of unchecked ambition. There was no redemption for Michael Calloway. No second chance, no dramatic comeback. There was only time, stretching out before him in endless, empty years, until eventually, he too would fade into history, forgotten by the world he had once ruled. The years continued to pass in the same relentless, suffocating rhythm. Time had a way of wearing down even the strongest of men, and Michael Calloway had long since ceased to be the man he once was. His world had shrunk to the confines of the prison walls, and whatever fight had once burned inside him had been extinguished by the monotonous routine of his existence. The arrogance, the defiance, the belief that he could somehow turn things around had long since faded. At first, he had clung to the idea that he would find a way out, not necessarily through escape, but through some legal technicality, some overlooked loophole that his lawyers might uncover. He had spent the early months poring over legal documents, writing letters, trying to strategize as if this was just another corporate battle, another crisis to be managed. But the legal system did not operate like the financial world, where rules could be bent, where influence could shift outcomes. Here, the system was rigid, unforgiving. There was no negotiating his way out of a guilty verdict. No amount of intelligence or persuasion could erase the evidence against him. His appeals were denied one by one, each rejection further hammering home the truth that this was not temporary. This was not a setback. This was his life now. And so he adapted slowly, reluctantly. The suits and expensive watches were gone, replaced by a plain prison uniform. The taste of fine wine and gourmet meals was a distant memory, replaced by the bland, repetitive meals served on plastic trays. The sharp, calculated conversations of the financial elite were replaced by the gruff, weary voices of fellow inmates, each with their own stories of downfall, of bad decisions, of lives they had once imagined differently. He learned the unwritten rules of prison life, the things that weren't in the official handbook, but were essential to survival. He learned to navigate the unspoken hierarchies, to recognize which inmates to avoid, which guards could be reasoned with, and which ones thrived on making the lives of prisoners miserable. He learned to keep his head down, to avoid unnecessary conflicts, to speak only when necessary. In the outside world, he had been a man of power, a man whose words carried weight. Here, words meant little. Survival was dictated by silence, by endurance. The loneliness was the hardest part, the absence of the life he had once known, the knowledge that the world had moved on without him. He had once been surrounded by people, colleagues, investors, admirers, people who had sought his advice, who had hung on to his every word. Now he was utterly alone. The people who had once called themselves his friends had disappeared the moment his empire collapsed. There were no visitors, no letters, no messages of support. He had burned too many bridges, had betrayed too much trust. And now, he was paying the price. Occasionally, he would catch glimpses of the outside world. Brief flashes of news reports playing on the communal television, snippets of conversations between guards about market trends or corporate scandals. He would listen, absorbing what little information he could, but it was never enough. The world outside was evolving, changing, and he was frozen in time, trapped in a past that no longer existed. The strategies he had once mastered, the trends he had once predicted, none of it mattered anymore. He was obsolete, a relic of a different era. He tried, at times, to convince himself that this was justice, that he deserved this, that the lives he had ruined, the people he had deceived, were owed this punishment. But the human mind was not built for self-condemnation. Even in his darkest moments, there was always that small, lingering voice that whispered excuses, rationalizations. He had not set out to destroy lives. He had not planned for things to end this way. He had simply wanted more success, more influence, more control. And in the pursuit of more, he had lost everything. Regret was a strange thing. It did not arrive all at once, like a sudden storm. It crept in slowly, insidiously, in the quiet moments of the night when there was nothing left to distract him. He thought of the choices he had made, the moments where he could have walked away, where he could have chosen a different path. He thought of the people who had trusted him, who had believed in him. He wondered where they were now, how their lives had turned out. He wondered if they still thought of him, if they still felt the sting of betrayal, or if, like the rest of the world, they had simply moved on. Somewhere beyond these walls, the markets still rose and fell. Fortunes were still made and lost, and new names had taken his place in the financial elite. The world did not mourn the loss of Michael Calloway. It did not pause to acknowledge his downfall. It continued, indifferent, unyielding. And he, once a man who had shaped industries, who had dictated the flow of wealth, was now nothing more than an afterthought, a footnote in history, a cautionary tale for those who dared to believe they were untouchable. In the end, there was no grand revelation, no final moment of redemption. There was only the passage of time, the slow erosion of identity, the gradual acceptance that this was all that remained. He had once been a man of ambition, of brilliance, of boundless confidence. Now he was simply another prisoner, another forgotten soul lost in the endless, unchanging days of a life that no longer belonged to him. Michael Calloway had always imagined that prison would be loud, filled with shouting, the clatter of metal doors, the echoes of aggression bouncing off the cold, unforgiving walls. But in reality, it was the silence that disturbed him the most. A silence that settled in the bones, a quiet so thick it became a presence of its own. It was the silence of forgotten men, of lives that had been put on pause indefinitely, of time that no longer moved forward in any meaningful way. In the early days, he had tried to mark the passing of time, to keep track of days, weeks, months. He had scrawled dates into the cheap notebook they had given him, a poor replacement for the fine leather-bound planners he once carried. But as the pages filled with meaningless marks, he realized that keeping track only made it worse. There was no difference between Monday and Friday, no significance to the turn of a calendar page. The world outside moved on, but in here, time folded in on itself, each day bleeding into the next with no real distinction. Sleep was no refuge. He had once been the kind of man who could sleep anywhere, on planes, in the back of cars, even during meetings when someone less important than him was speaking. But now, in the uncomfortable cot of his cell, sleep was an elusive, teasing thing. The mattress was thin, the pillow worse, and the constant awareness of being watched, of sharing space with men who had nothing left to lose, made true rest impossible. He would drift in and out, caught in the uneasy place between wakefulness and dreams, his mind filling the void with memories of a life he could no longer touch. Sometimes he would dream of his office, large glass windows overlooking the city, the hum of deals being made, the weight of power sitting comfortably on his shoulders. He would wake up expecting to hear the soft click of his assistant's heels approaching his desk, the buzz of his phone lighting up with notifications that meant he was still important, still relevant. But instead, he would find himself staring at the ceiling of his cell, the reality of where he was sinking in all over again. He thought about the people he had betrayed, investors who had trusted him, employees who had built their lives around the stability of his company, friends who had once admired him. He wondered what they said about him now, whether his name still carried weight in hushed conversations, or if it had been reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale, a ghost of a scandal that the world had already moved past. He wondered if they thought of him with anger, with pity, or worse, if they did not think of him at all. The outside world had forgotten him, but the ghosts of his past refused to let go. They visited him in the quiet moments, in the stretch of hours when there was nothing to do but think. He saw their faces in the reflection of the polished steel of his cell door, heard their voices in the distant murmurs of other inmates. He tried to justify his choices, tried to convince himself that he had done what anyone in his position would have done, that the world of finance had always been built on illusion, on the fine line between brilliance and deception. But the weight of his actions settled differently now, no longer buffered by the armor of wealth and power. There were no more calculations to make, no more deals to negotiate. His mind, once sharp, once capable of dissecting complex financial structures in an instant, now had nothing to focus on but itself. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Case 2. The town of Orange, Australia, had always been a place where people felt safe, where the air was crisp with the scent of eucalyptus trees and the streets were lined with charming heritage buildings. It was a quiet town, the kind where neighbors knew each other by name, and where the biggest excitement of the week was a new shop opening on the main street. But in the year 2012, Orange would become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Australian history. A case that would leave an indelible scar on the community. A case that would shake the very foundation of trust that small towns thrived on. The man at the heart of it all was Danny Price, a 42-year-old local who had spent his life blending into the fabric of Orange. He was the kind of man people barely noticed, and that was exactly how he liked it. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing that would set off alarm bells in the minds of those who passed him on the street. He worked as a handyman, fixing fences, repairing broken windows, painting old houses. To the people of Orange, he was just another blue-collar worker, another face in the crowd. But there was another side to Danny, one that no one had ever seen. Beneath his quiet demeanor, beneath the dust-stained overalls and the calloused hands, was a man whose mind was slowly unraveling. He had always been a drifter, never staying in one place for too long, always moving from job to job, house to house. He never spoke much about his past, never let anyone get too close. And perhaps, if anyone had looked a little deeper, they would have seen the cracks in the facade. Danny lived alone in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. It was a place that looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds snaking through the cracks in the driveway, and a sagging front porch that seemed to groan under the weight of time. Few people had ever been inside, and those who had never stayed long. There was something about the house that made people uneasy, something about the way the windows were always covered, the way the air inside felt thick, heavy. For years, Danny had been harboring a secret that would only come to light when police, responding to a missing persons report, forced their way into his home on a cold winter morning in June 2012. What they found inside would send shockwaves through the town, through the country, through the world. It was a crime so calculated, so methodically executed, that it defied comprehension. The first thing the officers noticed was the smell. It was a stench that clung to the walls, to the very air itself, a mix of decay, mold, and something else, something metallic. As they moved deeper into the house, stepping over piles of old newspapers and discarded clothing, they found the first of many horrors. In the back room, in a space no larger than a closet, they found the remains of two people, both reported missing months earlier. Their bodies were wrapped in plastic, stacked like forgotten possessions. But that was just the beginning. As they continued their search, they uncovered more remains, more evidence of a crime that had gone undetected for far too long. Danny Price was no ordinary handyman. He was a predator, a collector of lives. And for years, he had managed to operate in the shadows, unnoticed, unseen. But now, his secrets were spilling out into the light, revealing a darkness that no one in Orange had ever imagined. As the news of Daniel Price's crime spread through Orange, the town found itself in a state of shock, disbelief, and horror. This was not the kind of place where such things happened. The people of Orange prided themselves on their strong sense of community, their trust in one another. But now that trust had been shattered. People who had once walked the streets without fear now double-checked their locks at night. Parents who had once let their children roam freely in the parks now held them close. The town, once a peaceful refuge, had become a place of whispered conversations and darting eyes, as if the darkness that had lurked unseen for so long still lingered in the air. The investigation into Danny's crimes quickly escalated into one of the most extensive forensic examinations in Australian history. His house was no longer just a crime scene. It was a labyrinth of horror, a puzzle of unspeakable brutality that the police struggled to piece together. Every room, every corner of that decaying house seemed to hold another piece of the story, another glimpse into the twisted mind of the man they had so easily overlooked for years. The evidence suggested that Danny had been operating in silence for nearly a decade, his crimes carefully hidden beneath the mundane routine of his life. The more investigators uncovered, the more chilling the case became. It was not just about the bodies they had found, though that alone was horrifying enough. It was about the meticulous way in which he had selected his victims, the methodical approach he had taken to their suffering. They were all drifters, people with few ties, few connections, men and women who had come to Orange in search of work, of a fresh start, of something better. Some were backpackers passing through, hitchhiking their way across the country, while others were locals who had fallen on hard times. They were people who, for the most part, would not be immediately missed, whose disappearances could be easily dismissed as simply moving on to the next town. But Danny had not just taken them. He had studied them, watched them, waited for the right moment. In his house, police found a collection of journals, detailed notes about each of his victims, where he had first seen them, what they had been wearing, how they had spoken. He wrote about their habits, their movements, their fears. It was as if he had been crafting stories about them in his mind long before he ever made them a part of his dark reality. Some of the journals contained sketches, eerie renderings of faces that would later match missing persons reports. Others contained cryptic messages, phrases that made little sense at first, but, when read in the context of what they had discovered, painted a picture of a man who saw himself as something more than just a killer. He saw himself as an artist, sculpting tragedy in flesh and bone. In one particularly disturbing discovery, police found a hidden basement beneath the house, a room that had never been mentioned in any of the official records of the property. The door to the basement was concealed beneath an old rug, and the only way to open it was through a complex system of pulleys hidden in the wall. When officers finally managed to pry it open, they were met with the sight of a space so perfectly constructed for its sinister purpose that it was clear this had been years in the making. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, ensuring that no screams would ever escape. The room was filled with tools, restraints, and a single wooden chair in the center, its armrests worn smooth from use. It was here that Danny had carried out the worst of his crimes, and as forensic teams combed through the space, they began to uncover the full extent of his depravity. Bloodstains, long since dried, marred the concrete floor. Scraps of fabric, torn from clothing, were found in the corners. And on a rusted metal tray, investigators found something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Small trinkets, keepsakes taken from each of his victims. A bracelet, a ring, a lock of hair. Each item represented a life that had been stolen, a person who had suffered in that room, alone and unseen. The question that loomed over everyone's mind was the same. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How had a man like Danny Price managed to walk among them, unnoticed, unchallenged? The truth was unsettling. It was because he had been ordinary. He had never drawn attention to himself, never given anyone a reason to suspect him. He had lived a life of quiet anonymity, blending so seamlessly into the background that no one had ever thought to look closer. And in that anonymity, he had thrived. But now, his secrets were laid bare, and the town of Orange would never be the same again. The trust that had once defined this small, close-knit community was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. No one wanted to admit it, but deep down they all wondered the same thing. If someone like Danny Price had been able to exist among them unnoticed, how many others were out there, waiting in the shadows? As the forensic team meticulously combed through Danny Price's house, the weight of their discoveries pressed heavily upon them. The darkened basement, filled with its macabre remnants, was only the beginning. Investigators found hidden compartments within the walls, some containing personal belongings of the victims, others revealing disturbing evidence of Price's calculated cruelty. Each room, each corner of the house, whispered stories of unimaginable suffering, each item left behind a testament to the horrors that had taken place within those walls. The journals, stacked neatly in a locked cabinet, provided the most chilling insight into Price's mind. There were dozens of them, each meticulously filled with notes, sketches, and observations. He had written about his victims as if they were subjects in a scientific study, chronicling their movements, their habits, and their eventual demise. He described their fear in unsettling detail, noting their reactions to pain, their attempts to reason with him, their final, desperate pleas. But what disturbed investigators the most was the cold, detached manner in which he wrote about them. There was no remorse, no emotion, only a clinical, almost obsessive fascination with the suffering he inflicted. It became clear that Price had not simply been a man who gave in to dark urges. He had been a predator, methodical and patient. He had stalked his victims with the precision of a hunter, selecting them based on their vulnerabilities, their lack of strong social ties, their ability to disappear without raising suspicion. He had taken his time, ensuring that every aspect of his crimes was controlled, leaving as little evidence as possible. And he had succeeded, until now. Further investigation into his past revealed unsettling truths. Price had been a drifter in his early years, moving from town to town across Australia, taking on odd jobs, and never staying in one place for too long. He had no close friends, no family to speak of, no lasting relationships. He was a ghost, existing on the fringes of society, unnoticed and unremarkable. But as police looked deeper, they found patterns, disappearances that coincided with his movements, missing persons cases that had never been solved. It soon became evident that the bodies found in his backyard were only a fraction of the lives he had taken. There were likely many more, scattered across different towns and cities, their fates unknown. He had been doing this for years, perfecting his methods, refining his techniques. The discovery of his house was not the beginning of his story. It was merely the end of a long, hidden reign of terror. But even with the overwhelming evidence against him, Price refused to speak. During interrogations, he remained silent, his expression blank. He did not deny the accusations, nor did he offer any explanations. He simply sat there, unflinching, as detectives laid out the horrors they had uncovered. It was as if he was content to let the evidence speak for itself, knowing that no amount of words could truly convey the depths of his depravity. As the case unfolded in the media, the people of Orange struggled to come to terms with the reality of what had happened in their midst. They had lived alongside a monster, oblivious to the darkness that had festered in their own backyard. The realization shattered their sense of security, leaving them with a lingering unease that would not fade easily. Parents held their children closer, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and the once tight-knit community found itself fractured by fear and doubt. The trial, when it finally began, was one of the most high-profile in Australian history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and members of the public who had followed the case with morbid fascination. The evidence presented was damning: DNA traces, surveillance footage, Price's own meticulous records. There was no question of his guilt. The only question was whether he would ever reveal the full extent of his crimes. But he remained silent. Even as the families of his victims begged for answers, even as prosecutors laid bare the horrors he had committed, he did not speak. His expression never changed, his demeanor never wavered. It was as if he had already made peace with his fate, as if he had accepted the inevitability of his own downfall. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for many, that was not enough. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many lives unaccounted for. Price had taken his secrets with him, leaving behind only the ruins of the lives he had destroyed. And so, even as he faded from public memory, his shadow remained. The house on the edge of town was torn down, its foundations dug up, its land left barren. But the scars he had left on Orange, on the families he had shattered, on the investigators who had uncovered his horrors, would never truly heal. The town had changed, its innocence lost forever. For those who had once known Danny Price as nothing more than a quiet, unassuming man, the truth was almost too much to bear. He had walked among them, unnoticed, his darkness hidden beneath an ordinary face. And that, more than anything, was what haunted them the most. The prison walls that confined Danny Price were stark and lifeless, devoid of any warmth or humanity. He had been moved to a maximum security facility, a place designed for those society had deemed beyond redemption. There, Among the most dangerous men in Australia, he was no longer the one in control. No longer the predator. No longer the hunter. He was just another inmate, another number in the system, watched at all times, his every movement monitored. But Price did not react the way others expected him to. There was no fear in his eyes, no sense of regret or desperation. He simply existed, following the daily routine without resistance or complaint. He did not speak to the other inmates. He did not seek alliances. He did not even show frustration at the isolation imposed upon him. Instead, he seemed almost content, as if he had already made peace with his fate long before his trial had even begun. The guards who observed him found this unsettling. They were used to inmates who lashed out, who broke under the weight of their confinement, who begged for some form of reprieve. But Price was different. His silence was not that of a man defeated, but of a man who had nothing left to say. It was as though he had already detached himself from the world outside, from the consequences of his actions, from the suffering he had caused. Meanwhile, the people of Orange struggled to move on. The town had changed irreversibly, its streets carrying the weight of the crimes that had unfolded within them. The house where Price had lived was gone, demolished as if erasing it from existence could somehow erase the memories of what had transpired there. But the land remained barren, untouched, as if the soil itself rejected the idea of new life growing upon it. No one wanted to build there. No one wanted to live near it. It became a place of whispers, of uneasy glances, of hurried footsteps. For the families of the victims, closure was an elusive concept. Price had taken their loved ones from them in ways that defied comprehension, and though he was behind bars, the pain he had inflicted did not fade. The finality of his life sentence did little to fill the void left by those who would never return. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many gaps in the timeline, too many bodies unaccounted for. Law enforcement continued their investigations, scouring records, revisiting cold cases, retracing Price's steps across the country. The evidence found in his journals suggested that the number of his victims far exceeded those discovered in his backyard. There were names that did not match any known cases, descriptions of individuals who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Some of the locations he mentioned in his writings led to renewed searches in remote areas, abandoned buildings, stretches of wilderness where the missing might still lie undiscovered. And yet, no matter how much they uncovered, there was always the lingering fear that they would never know the full truth. Price had been meticulous, calculating. He had taken measures to ensure that much of what he had done would never be found. He had spent years perfecting his ability to disappear into the background, to operate unseen, to erase the existence of those he chose to take. The psychological impact of his crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The people who had once known him, or thought they had known him, grappled with the reality of his true nature. Former neighbors questioned their own judgment, wondering how they could have lived so close to a man capable of such horrors without ever suspecting a thing. Those who had once exchanged casual pleasantries with him in passing now recoiled at the memory, sickened by the thought that they had unknowingly spoken to a murderer. Even those who had only followed the case from afar were affected. Stories like this left scars on entire communities, reminding people of the fragility of safety, of the darkness that could lurk behind the most unassuming facades. It was no longer just a crime story. It was a warning, a haunting reminder that monsters did not always look like monsters. As time passed, Price remained an enigma. He did not appeal his sentence. He did not seek attention. He did not give interviews. He remained in his cell, existing in the same silence he had carried with him from the moment of his arrest. Some believed he took satisfaction in knowing that there were still secrets buried in the world, still mysteries that only he held the answers to. Others suspected that he had simply lost interest in the game once he had been caught, as if the thrill of control had faded the moment he no longer held power over others. But despite his silence, the investigation did not stop. The Australian authorities, along with specialists in forensic psychology and criminal profiling, continued to dissect every piece of evidence, searching for patterns, for overlooked details, for anything that might lead them to the missing. Some of the missing persons cases connected to him stretched back decades, and the sheer scale of his movements made tracking every possible crime an immense challenge. Investigators reached out to law enforcement in other countries, particularly those Price had visited in his younger years, to see if similar disappearances had occurred abroad. They found that in some places he had left no trace, but in others, there were unsettling similarities to his known crimes. Unsolved cases that mirrored his methods, victims whose profiles matched those he had written about. Even in death, Danny Price would not be forgotten. His name would be studied in criminology courses, analyzed in psychological profiles, discussed in true crime documentaries. But for those who had lost loved ones to his darkness, he was not just a case study, not just a name in a textbook. He was the man who had shattered their world, who had taken from them something they could never get back. In Orange, the echoes of his crimes lingered. The town had tried to move on, tried to reclaim its sense of normalcy, but some wounds never fully heal. The streets that had once felt familiar now carried an invisible weight, a quiet reminder that safety was never truly guaranteed. And somewhere in the vastness of Australia, beneath soil undisturbed or within places forgotten, there were still answers waiting to be found. Years passed, but the shadow of Danny Price never truly faded. His name became a whispered cautionary tale, a specter that lingered in the collective memory of Australia. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail of his case, speculating about the secrets he had taken to his grave. Psychologists and criminologists continued to analyze his mind, searching for answers that would help prevent another like him from emerging. Yet, despite all the studies, all the theories, there was one truth that remained immutable. Danny Price had left behind scars that could never fully heal. The people of Orange had tried to move on, to rebuild, to reclaim their town from the darkness he had cast over it. Some succeeded. The younger generation, those who had not lived through the horror firsthand, found it easier to distance themselves from the past. They saw the town as it was in the present, not as it had been during Price's reign of terror. But for those who had been there, for those who had lost loved ones or had lived in fear, the wounds remained just beneath the surface. Some people left, unable to bear the weight of what had happened. They packed up their lives and moved to distant cities, seeking a fresh start where they would no longer have to walk the same streets Price had once walked, no longer have to pass by the empty lot where his house had stood. Others stayed, determined to reclaim their home, refusing to let the memory of a murderer drive them away. But there were places in Orange that no one wanted to claim, places that remained untouched, overgrown with weeds and silence. The land where Price's house had stood was one of them. Developers had attempted to sell it, to build something new in its place, but every attempt failed. Buyers backed out at the last moment, their unease overpowering whatever logic told them that land was just land, that the past did not linger in soil and stone. The stories surrounding that place only grew with time. Some claimed to hear strange noises at night when they walked past, whispers, distant sobs, the rustling of movement in the dark. Others swore they had seen figures standing in the empty lot, just beyond the reach of streetlights, watching. Whether these were just the workings of overactive imaginations, or something more was a question no one wanted to investigate too closely. Law enforcement, though officially finished with the case, never truly closed it. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. The files remained open, and every so often, another investigator would take a fresh look, hoping to find something that had been missed. They combed through cold cases across the country, cross-referencing them with Price's known movements, trying to uncover the full extent of his crimes. And they found more. Not all of them could be proven. Some cases had too little evidence, too many years between the crime and the present. But the patterns were undeniable. Missing persons cases that bore his signature, unsolved disappearances in places he had visited, bodies recovered in remote areas with signs that matched his methods. The number of his victims had always been an estimate, but as more connections were made, it became clear that the real number was far higher than anyone had initially believed. He had killed more than what had been found in his backyard. He had killed across states, across years, slipping through the cracks, leaving only traces behind. Families of the missing were contacted, given the grim possibility that their loved ones had fallen prey to him. For some, it was an answer they had been waiting for, even if it was not the answer they had hoped to receive. For others, it only deepened their grief, solidifying the finality of a loss they had long suspected but never confirmed. As the years continued to pass, the legend of Danny Price transformed. He became more than just a murderer in the annals of Australian crime. He became a symbol of fear, of the unseen dangers lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. True crime books were written about him. Documentaries were filmed. Psychological studies examined his behaviors, his upbringing, his lack of remorse. Some painted him as a born predator, someone whose darkness had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Others speculated about environmental factors, about the moments that might have shaped him into what he became. But in the end, none of it changed the reality of what he had done. The prison where he had spent his last years continued on without him, its walls holding the memories of countless other criminals. His cell was emptied, cleaned, reassigned. The guards who had watched over him moved on to other inmates, other cases. Yet every so often, his name would surface again, whispered among those who had followed his case, appearing in new discoveries of bodies linked to him, discussed in academic circles as an example of the depths of human depravity. And somewhere, perhaps buried deep in the wilderness, beneath the shifting sands of time, there were still secrets left unfound. Decades passed, and yet, in the corners of Australia's criminal history, Danny Price's name never truly faded. His case remained an enigma, a tangled web of horror that continued to haunt those who had lived through it. For many, he was just a figure in the pages of history, a cautionary tale of unchecked evil. But for others, the families of the victims, the officers who had hunted him, the journalists who had chronicled his crimes, his shadow still lingered in ways the public could never fully grasp. The town of Orange, despite its best efforts, was never quite the same. There were those who tried to erase him from memory, to push forward, to insist that Price was an anomaly, and that the town should not be defined by a monster who once walked its streets. Businesses continued to thrive, families continued to build their lives, and new generations grew up knowing his name only through hushed conversations between their parents or the occasional news special. But there were also those who could never forget, the ones who had been there, who had felt the fear in their bones when the truth of his crimes had come to light. For them, time did not heal. Time merely dulled the edges of the horror, but it never erased it. Some of them left, moving away in search of peace, of a life untainted by the past. Others stayed, unable or unwilling to abandon the place they had always called home, despite the ghosts that lurked within it. But even beyond Orange, even beyond Australia, Price's legacy refused to be buried. His crimes had left deep wounds, wounds that rippled outward, touching lives in ways that would never fully be understood. The families of his victims, some of whom had never even known their loved ones had fallen prey to him until years after his death, were left with questions that could never be answered. How long had he been hunting? How many more had he killed that they still did not know about? Even in death, he was a puzzle that refused to be solved. Law enforcement, despite officially closing the case, never truly abandoned it. Detectives and criminal analysts, some too young to have been part of the original investigation, still combed through cold cases, still compared unsolved murders and disappearances to the known patterns of Price's killings. And they continued to find connections. Each discovery, though bringing a measure of closure to some, only deepened the mystery for others. New names were added to the growing list of his suspected victims, names of people who had vanished decades ago, their fates unknown until now. Their families, after years of uncertainty, finally had answers. But answers did not always bring peace. Some wanted justice, but how could justice be served on a man already long dead? Some wanted to understand, to know what had driven him to do the things he did. But understanding Price meant looking into a darkness that most people would rather turn away from. And some, even after all this time, still feared him. There were those who believed he had not acted alone. Rumors persisted, whispers of accomplices who had never been caught, of others who had helped him in ways small or large. Some speculated that Price had not worked in isolation, that his crimes had been part of something larger, something hidden. But whether these theories were based on truth or paranoia, no one could say for certain. The land where his house had once stood remained untouched. No one wanted it. No developers would build on it. No one would buy it. It was as if the very earth rejected the idea of new life growing where so much death had occurred. Even the most skeptical avoided it, as if something unseen but deeply felt warned them to stay away. Stories surrounded it, of strange noises in the night, of figures glimpsed in the shadows, of a sense of unease that clung to the air like fog. Paranormal investigators came, drawn by the whispers of something lingering beyond death. But whether they found anything or not, the feeling of dread remained. Even those who did not believe in ghosts could not deny the weight of history, the way certain places seemed forever marked by what had happened there. Price had been a man of flesh and blood, but his presence, his legacy, had transcended death. It was in the nightmares of those who had survived him. It was in the hollow grief of the families who had lost loved ones to him. It was in the unanswered questions, the lingering doubts, the spaces between what was known and what would never be known. And perhaps, most disturbingly, it was in the knowledge that there would always be others like him. For all the efforts of law enforcement, for all the studies done by psychologists and criminologists, For all the books written and the documentaries filmed, the truth remained unshaken. Monsters did not simply vanish with time. Somewhere in some other town, in some other city, another Danny Price was waiting to be discovered. And when he was, the cycle would begin again. Case 3. Logan City had seen its share of crime over the decades, but nothing quite like what unfolded in the winter of 1997. It was the kind of case that would linger in the minds of residents for generations. A case that turned an ordinary suburban neighborhood into the backdrop of one of Australia's most haunting criminal investigations. And at the heart of it all was a man whose name would forever be etched into the city's darkest history, Russell Kane. Russell Kane was not a man who stood out. At 42 years old, he was the kind of person most people would pass by on the street without a second glance. He was quiet, polite when spoken to, and had lived in Logan City for nearly 15 years without causing much of a stir. A carpenter by trade, he spent most of his time working on home renovations, often taking jobs in and around the city. He was known for being meticulous in his craft, his hands skilled with wood and precision. But beneath that surface of normalcy lay something far more sinister. Kane had grown up in a strict household in rural Queensland, raised by a father who was both a religious fanatic and an unforgiving disciplinarian. His childhood was marked by rigid rules, long hours spent reciting scripture, and severe punishment for the smallest infractions. His mother, quiet and passive, rarely intervened. When Kane turned 18, he left home and never looked back. But the lessons of his upbringing clung to him in ways he could never fully escape. He built a life in Logan City, working steadily, making just enough money to get by. He lived alone, never married, never had children. Those who knew him would later say that he was a bit of a loner, but not in a way that seemed particularly alarming. He kept to himself, was never seen with friends, and spent most of his free time tinkering in his backyard shed. To those who had hired him for carpentry work, he was reliable, if a little peculiar. He rarely made eye contact, spoke only when necessary, and always seemed to finish his jobs with an almost obsessive attention to detail. But what no one knew, what no one could have even begun to suspect, was that Kane's shed was more than just a workspace for woodworking. It was a place where he carried out a secret life, a place where the lines between craft and compulsion blurred into something monstrous. It wasn't until early July of 1997 that the first signs of trouble emerged. A young woman, 22-year-old Jessica Rowe, was reported missing by her parents. She had last been seen leaving a friend's house in Logan City, a route that should have taken her no more than 20 minutes to walk home. But she never arrived. In the days that followed, search efforts were launched. Flyers were posted across the city. Friends and family pleaded for any information, but no trace of her was found. Weeks passed, then another disappearance. 34-year-old Daniel Mercer, a truck driver making his usual route through Logan City, failed to return home one evening. His wife called his workplace, only to be told that he had finished his shift and left on time. His truck was later found abandoned on the outskirts of the city, keys still in the ignition, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic began to spread. 2 disappearances in such a short span of time, both individuals vanishing without a trace. Theories swirled, but police had little to work with. There were no signs of struggle, no indications of where they might have gone. And then, nearly 3 months after Jessica Rowe had gone missing, the first breakthrough came. But it was not the kind of discovery anyone had hoped for. A group of hikers, trekking through a heavily wooded area just beyond Logan City, stumbled upon something unusual. A makeshift wooden box, partially buried beneath a cluster of trees. It looked out of place, deliberately placed there. Curious, they approached, brushing away the dirt, and that was when they noticed the smell. A sickly, unmistakable odor. By the time police arrived, the box had already been partially opened. What they found inside sent shockwaves through the entire city. Jessica Rowe's remains were carefully placed inside, her body wrapped in cloth. But what truly horrified investigators was the condition of her remains. Her arms and legs had been bound with an intricate series of knots, and markings on her skin suggested she had been held captive for days, possibly weeks, before her death. There were signs of malnourishment, dehydration, and something else that sent shivers through even the most seasoned officers. There were patterns, deliberate carvings on her skin, symbols that had been carefully etched with precision. This was no ordinary crime. This was something calculated, ritualistic. With a confirmed homicide now on their hands, the Logan City police intensified their efforts. They re-examined missing persons reports, combed through Jessica Rowe's known whereabouts, and began interviewing anyone who might have seen her the night she vanished. But leads were scarce. It wasn't until they cross-referenced her last known location with past crime reports that they found something unusual, something that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. A report from nearly 5 years earlier, filed by a woman who claimed she had been followed while walking home. She described a man, someone she couldn't fully identify, but she remembered one thing clearly. The man had been carrying a small wooden carving. It was an odd detail, one that might have been dismissed if not for what investigators found next. In the basement of the Logan City Police Archives, tucked away in an old storage file, they uncovered another report. Nearly identical. Another woman, another late-night encounter with an unknown man holding a carved wooden object. The descriptions varied, but one thing stood out. The carving. A crude, unfinished wooden figure, its shape distorted, its surface rough, almost as if it had been made in a hurry. Police began to widen their search, looking into anyone with known woodworking skills in the area. And that was when Russell Kane's name surfaced. Police began scrutinizing Russell Kane's background, looking for any connection between him and the victims. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. He had never been arrested. No complaints had been filed against him. But as investigators started piecing together his whereabouts on the nights Jessica Rowe and Daniel Mercer disappeared, patterns emerged, patterns that could not be ignored. Kane's carpentry jobs often took him all over Logan City. He worked in homes, businesses, and even did occasional repairs at community centers. His schedule was erratic, with no set hours, allowing him to move freely without raising suspicion. But what struck investigators was how often he had worked in neighborhoods where missing persons cases had been reported. It was subtle, never enough to draw attention at the time. But in hindsight, it painted a chilling picture. Police obtained a warrant to search his home, a small weatherboard house on the outskirts of Logan City. The property itself was unremarkable, the kind of place that blended into the background. But as soon as they stepped inside, a sense of unease settled over the officers. The house was immaculately clean, almost unnaturally so. Every tool in the workshop was arranged with precision, every surface wiped spotless. It was the kind of order that felt less like tidiness and more like control. But it was what they found in the shed that changed everything. At first glance, it looked like any other carpenter's workspace. Wooden planks, sawdust covering the floor, half-finished furniture pieces leaning against the walls. But then they noticed the carvings. Dozens of them. Small, crudely shaped wooden figures lined the shelves, each one unique yet eerily similar. Some were simple humanoid shapes, faceless and unfinished. Others had been carefully etched with patterns, strange symbols that mirrored the ones found on Jessica Rowe's body. And then, tucked away in a dusty corner, they found something even more disturbing. A set of wooden boxes, each one meticulously crafted, varnished, and reinforced with nails. They looked like miniature coffins. One of the officers pried open the lid of the largest box, expecting to find more carvings inside. Instead, what they found made them recoil in horror. Inside was a collection of objects, locks of hair, pieces of clothing, and small personal items that, upon closer inspection, were identified as belonging to missing persons. A bracelet that Jessica Rowe had been wearing the night she disappeared. A keychain with Daniel Mercer's initials. And most chilling of all, an old newspaper clipping about a woman who had vanished years earlier, long before the recent cases. The evidence was undeniable. Kane was brought in for questioning. At first, he remained silent, his expression unreadable. He neither denied nor confirmed anything. But when confronted with the items found in his shed, something in his demeanor shifted. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled deeply, and for the first time spoke. But what he said offered no clarity. They were meant to be preserved, he murmured, almost to himself. They were meant to last. The words sent a shudder through the room. Forensic teams combed through every inch of his property, searching for more evidence. And what they uncovered turned an already horrifying case into something even darker. Beneath the wooden floorboards of the shed, they found a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, were human remains. It wasn't just Jessica Rowe and Daniel Mercer. There were more. Victims that no one had even realized were missing. The extent of Kane's crimes was staggering. Over the years, he had abducted, imprisoned, and ultimately killed at least 8 individuals, possibly more. Some were runaways. Others were people whose disappearances had never been linked together. All had fallen into Kane's hands, their final moments spent in that silent shed, surrounded by his twisted craftsmanship. But what disturbed investigators the most was the realization that this was not a crime of impulse. Everything had been planned, every victim chosen carefully, every action executed with precision. Russell Kane was not a man who had lost control. He was a man who had perfected it. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, cataloging every piece of evidence found on Russell Kane's property. What had initially appeared to be the site of a meticulous craftsman was, in reality, something far more sinister. The wooden figures, the small coffin-like boxes, the hidden remains beneath the floorboards. Each discovery painted a darker portrait of the man they had in custody. Authorities dug deeper into Kane's past, searching for any clue that could explain how he had transformed from an unassuming carpenter into one of the most prolific murderers in Logan City's history. What they found was unsettling. Kane had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home, never staying in one place for long. His records were sparse, with only a few mentions of behavioral issues, nothing that hinted at what he would later become. He had no close friends, no romantic partners that anyone could recall, and outside of his work, he lived an isolated existence. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. He never engaged in small talk, never attended community events, never seemed interested in anything beyond his woodworking. Some remembered seeing him in his yard late at night, carving figures by the dim glow of his porch light, but no one had ever suspected anything beyond eccentricity. As the case against him built, prosecutors faced a challenge. Kane had never left behind traditional evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clear signs of forced entry in any of the victims' homes. His ability to operate undetected for years spoke to an almost surgical level of precision. But there was one thing that investigators had yet to determine. Why? What had driven him to choose these victims? What was the significance of the carvings, the keepsakes, the carefully preserved remains? Psychologists were brought in to assess Kane's mental state. Some believed he was a control-driven predator, someone who took pleasure in dominating his victims both physically and psychologically. Others suggested a ritualistic element, pointing to the symbols carved into the wooden figures and the methodical way he had arranged each item in his shed. But Kane himself offered no explanation. He listened to the accusations without reaction. He met the evidence with silence. And when asked to confess, he simply tilted his head, as if considering the request, before saying, "Some things are meant to be remembered." The trial became one of the most infamous in Logan City's history. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, their grief palpable as prosecutors presented the horrors of Kane's crimes. The jury listened in stunned silence as experts detailed how Kane had lured his victims, how he had kept them captive, how he had ultimately ended their lives. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, there was no outburst, no sign of remorse from Kane. He simply sat there, as still as the wooden figures he had carved. The weight of the verdict settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Families clutched tissues in trembling hands, some whispering prayers, others staring blankly ahead as the reality of what they had endured reached its final chapter in the legal system. The judge's voice cut through the stillness, sentencing Russell Kane to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But even as the gavel struck, it was clear that the wounds he had left behind would never fully heal. As Kane was led away in shackles, his expression remained unchanged, distant, indifferent, unreadable. It was as if the entire ordeal was merely an inconvenience to him, an interruption to whatever dark world he had created within his mind. Those who had hoped for a confession, for an apology, for even the faintest flicker of regret in his eyes, were left disappointed. Kane had no interest in giving anyone closure. He had built his crimes with the same precision as his woodwork, clean, calculated, and final. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. The case had gripped Logan City for months, a horrifying descent into the mind of a killer who had lurked undetected for years. The media dissected every detail, from Kane's childhood to his methodical approach to murder, each new revelation sending shivers through the community. But as time passed, the news cycle moved on, as it always did. Other crimes, other tragedies took center stage. The name Russell Kane slowly faded from headlines, his face no longer plastered across televisions and front pages. But for those who had lost loved ones, the nightmare never ended. The scars he had carved into their lives could never be sanded down or smoothed over. In the quiet suburbs of Logan City, a lingering unease remained. The knowledge that a man like Kane had lived among them for so long without suspicion was a sobering reminder of the darkness that could hide in plain sight. Parents locked their doors earlier, neighborhoods watched more closely, and the small-town sense of security was forever altered. Yet there were still those who obsessed over the case, who searched for the missing pieces that the trial had left unanswered. Amateur sleuths scoured forums, dissecting Kane's past, analyzing his cryptic words in court, attempting to make sense of the senseless. Some believed he had chosen his victims at random. Others were convinced there was a deeper, hidden meaning in his carvings, a message left behind in the twisted art of his craft. Even within prison, Kane remained an enigma. He spoke little, interacted with no one unless absolutely necessary. Guards noted his meticulous habits, the way he arranged his cell with the same precision he once used in his workshop. He spent hours staring at the walls, as if lost in thought, as if still creating something in his mind, though what that was, no one could say. There was one final revelation that came years later, a discovery that sent shivers through even the most hardened investigators. A storage unit, rented under a different name, long forgotten until unpaid fees led to its auction. Inside, among crates of wood and half-finished sculptures, were more carvings, figures that bore striking resemblances to people who had never been reported missing, faces that were unaccounted for. It raised the most chilling question of all. Had Russell Kane's story truly ended? Or were there still secrets left buried, waiting in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? The discovery of the storage unit sent a shockwave through the already haunted remnants of Logan City. Investigators, who had long thought they had closed the book on Russell Kane's atrocities, found themselves staring into a darkness far deeper than they had imagined. The figures found within the dimly lit, dust-covered space were more than just wooden carvings. They were echoes of lives, etched in horrifying detail, their expressions frozen in an eerie state of despair. Some faces looked pained, others seemed eerily lifelike, as if they had been captured in their final moments. But what truly unsettled the forensic analysts was that not all of the figures matched the victims they had accounted for in Kane's known list of murders. There were more, at least a dozen more, unidentified, unnamed, unseen in any official report. As they examined the carvings, they realized Kane had included details no one outside the victims' families should have known. A scar hidden beneath a sleeve, a birthmark behind the ear, the precise pattern of freckles across a nose. It was as if he had studied them intimately, memorizing their every imperfection, ensuring no detail was lost. The implication was chilling. If these figures represented real people, then Russell Kane's true body count was far greater than what had been previously believed. And worse still, what if some of them had never been found at all? Detectives pored over missing persons reports, searching for any connections, any leads that could unravel the mystery of these unnamed victims. Some matched cold cases, long dismissed as runaways or accidents. Others had no clear history at all, as if they had simply vanished without a trace, never reported, never searched for. The media reignited the story with renewed frenzy. Once again, Kane's name dominated headlines, his face resurfacing in grim retrospectives and investigative specials. Survivors and families of victims found themselves dragged back into a nightmare they had tried desperately to move past. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Kane himself remained silent. In prison, he neither confirmed nor denied the new findings. He sat in his cell as he always had, a quiet specter of a man, neither proud nor remorseful, neither gloating nor repentant. He was a void, a hollow vessel, his thoughts locked away in an unreachable place. Authorities attempted to extract a confession, hoping for closure, for answers, for some kind of resolution. They presented him with photos of the carvings, with the faces of those he had immortalized in wood. They read him the names of the missing, hoping for even a flicker of acknowledgement. But Kane merely blinked, his eyes as lifeless as the figures he had created. Then, one day, he did something that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone who had spent years trying to understand him. He smiled. It was the first and last sign of emotion he ever showed, and it left a question lingering in the minds of those who had chased his crimes for so long. A question far more terrifying than any they had asked before. Had they truly caught all of his victims? Or were there more out there, lost in time, waiting to be found? The weight of the discovery loomed over Logan City, like a storm cloud that refused to break. The implications of what had been found in that storage unit stretched far beyond what any investigator had expected. The figures, so lifelike in their pain, were not merely the work of a murderer, but of an artist obsessed with suffering. Each carving told a story, each one capturing a soul that had been lost in the shadows of Russell Kane's twisted world. But the deeper authorities dug into his past, the more unsettling the truth became. Russell Kane had always been meticulous. He had lived a life of careful concealment, ensuring that no detail of his crimes ever surfaced until he allowed it to. But the storage unit had betrayed him. It had revealed that even when the world thought it had uncovered the full extent of his depravity, there were still layers left unexplored, victims still unheard, tragedies still unknown. As forensic specialists worked to extract DNA from the carvings, small remnants of blood, hair, or fibers that clung to the grain of the wood, it became clear that these figures were more than just representations. They were memorials, eerie tributes to people whose stories had never been told. A forensic analyst, exhausted after days of examination, let out a breath as she stepped back from one particular carving. It was smaller than the others, its features delicate and childlike. The eyes were wide, not with terror but with something far worse, resignation. A quiet acceptance of fate. She turned to her colleagues, her voice barely above a whisper. "This one doesn't match any missing person records." A cold silence fell over the room. How many more were there? Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline of Kane's crimes. They traced his movements through old employment records, traffic violations, real estate transactions, anything that could indicate where he had been during his years of hunting. What they found only deepened the horror. Kane had not confined his crimes to Logan City. There were patterns, subtle, almost imperceptible, that stretched across state lines, through rural towns and busy cities alike. The carvings in the storage unit were just the tip of an iceberg that had remained submerged for decades. A series of unexplained disappearances in New South Wales suddenly bore an eerie resemblance to Kane's known victims. A cluster of unsolved murders in Victoria, dismissed as unrelated, now seemed disturbingly connected. The nightmare was far from over. Authorities reopened cases that had long been considered cold. Families who had given up hope of ever finding answers were suddenly forced to confront the possibility that their loved ones had fallen into the hands of a monster who had hidden in plain sight. The media swarmed with theories, each more gruesome than the last. Documentaries were made, investigative journalists dug through archives, and conspiracy theorists spun tales of Kane operating within a hidden network of like-minded predators. But one question remained unanswered. Why had he kept the carvings? Why had a man so careful, so precise, so determined to remain undetected, chosen to create something that could one day expose him? Some believed it was a form of trophy-keeping, a way for him to relive his crimes without the risk of discovery. Others speculated that Kane had wanted to be caught, that on some level, he had left behind his work as a final act of confession. But those who had spent years studying his mind knew better. Kane never did anything without purpose, and as authorities scoured every inch of his past, another chilling possibility emerged. What if the storage unit wasn't a mistake? What if it was a message? To this day, the full scope of Russell Kane's crimes remains unknown. The figures in the storage unit, those haunting wooden faces, stand as the only testament to lives lost in silence, to stories never told, to names that may never be spoken again. And somewhere, in the depths of a prison cell, Russell Kane still sits in silence, still smiling. Case 4. The chilling tale of Michigan's most infamous criminal case began in the quiet town of Traverse City, a place known for its picturesque landscapes, cherry orchards, and tight-knit community. But in the year 1987, the town became infamous for something far more sinister, an unimaginable crime orchestrated by a man whose name would forever be etched in the state's darkest history, Samuel "Sam" Whitmore. Samuel Whitmore was an unremarkable man to those who passed him on the street. A middle-aged hardware store owner with a reserved demeanor, he blended seamlessly into the fabric of small-town life. He was the kind of person who attended community barbecues, never raised his voice in public, and dutifully attended church on Sundays. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, Sam harbored a secret life that would, years later, shatter the illusion of safety that Traverse City once held dear. Born in 1949, Sam had spent his early years in a household ruled by discipline and quiet cruelty. His father, a former Marine turned factory supervisor, was a man of rigid expectations, while his mother, an ever-anxious woman, tiptoed around the house as if afraid to disturb the dust. Sam grew up in an environment where silence was survival and emotion was weakness. By the time he was 15, he had already learned to mask his thoughts behind an expressionless face, a skill that would serve him well in the years to come. His adolescence was largely uneventful. No record of delinquency, no signs of instability. He worked odd jobs, saved his money, and eventually opened Whitmore Hardware, a small shop in the heart of town. To most, he was just another man trying to make a living. But behind the doors of his store, Sam had begun indulging in a fascination that had gripped him since childhood. An obsession with control, with watching, with knowing every movement of those around him. In the early 1980s, a series of disappearances began in northern Michigan. The victims were drifters, hitchhikers, and seasonal workers, people whose absences were unlikely to raise immediate alarms. Each case shared an unsettling similarity. No bodies, no struggle, no witnesses. The missing seemed to simply vanish into the wilderness, leaving behind only the mystery of their absence. For years, these disappearances were written off as unfortunate incidents. Young men and women leaving town without notice, moving on to bigger cities, or becoming victims of Michigan's harsh winters. But the reality was far more sinister. It wasn't until a particularly brutal winter storm in December 1987 that Samuel Whitmore's name would become known beyond the confines of Traverse City. That winter, a hunter named Mark Lasky was tracking deer in the dense woods outside of town when he stumbled upon something half buried in the snow. At first, he thought it was an animal carcass, but as he stepped closer, dread settled in his chest. A human skull, stripped clean by time and the elements, stared up at him. And just beyond it, scattered among the roots of an ancient oak, were more remains, bones, fragments of clothing, and something that sent chills down his spine. A rusted metal tag, the kind attached to work boots. Authorities were called, and as they combed the area, they uncovered a shallow graveyard, a hidden burial site containing the remains of at least 9 individuals. The case that would later be known as the Whitmore Woods killings had finally surfaced. What followed was an investigation that would unearth a horror beyond comprehension. Fingerprints on a rusted belt buckle linked one of the victims to a missing person case from 1983. Another set of remains matched a college student who had vanished while traveling through Michigan in 1985. As the number of identified victims grew, so did the questions. Who had done this? How had they managed to evade detection for so long? And most chilling of all, how many more remained undiscovered? The breakthrough came when forensic experts traced the origins of a particular brand of duct tape found at the burial site. It was an uncommon variety, sold only in select stores, including Whitmore hardware. The discovery set off a chain reaction of scrutiny. Law enforcement began piecing together records, questioning suppliers, and analyzing purchase history. And then, the final piece fell into place. An anonymous tip from a former employee of Whitmore Hardware who recalled something odd about the storage room in the back of the shop. With a search warrant in hand, investigators entered Whitmore Hardware on the evening of February 3, 1988. Inside, they found what appeared to be an ordinary storeroom. But hidden behind a false wall, they uncovered something far more disturbing, a meticulously organized collection of trophies. There were personal belongings, watches, rings, wallets, even small trinkets that once belonged to people who were now little more than bones in the frozen earth. There were photographs, some faded with time, depicting individuals in their last moments, faces frozen in terror. But the most horrifying discovery lay within a locked wooden chest, its contents revealing the true depth of Samuel Whitmore's darkness. Inside the chest were neatly stacked journals, each meticulously detailing his crimes. Every entry was written in an emotionless, calculated manner, chronicling the abduction, confinement, and eventual deaths of his victims. He wrote not with regret, nor with glee, but with the detachment of a man documenting routine tasks. His writings revealed a chilling truth. His victims had not been random. They had been chosen, studied, stalked. The journals were filled with details only the killer could have known. Dates, locations, methods. There was no doubt left. Samuel Whitmore, the quiet hardware store owner who had lived among the townspeople for decades, was the architect of one of Michigan's most horrifying crimes. His arrest sent shockwaves through the town. People who had once trusted him now recoiled in horror, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the monster he truly was. As he was led away in handcuffs, his expression remained eerily calm, detached, as if none of it truly mattered. But the true horror of Samuel Whitmore's crimes would only become fully known in the months that followed. Because as authorities continued their investigation, they realized that what they had found was only the beginning. The remains in the woods, the journals, the trophies, these were just the pieces they had uncovered. The real question loomed like a specter over the entire state of Michigan. How many more were still out there, waiting to be found? In the days following Samuel Whitmore's arrest, The town of Traverse City found itself gripped by an overwhelming sense of disbelief and fear. How could a man who had lived among them for decades, who had sold them tools and nails, who had once sponsored the local baseball team, be capable of such unimaginable horror? The people struggled to reconcile the friendly store owner they had known with the monster the police had exposed. But for the investigators tasked with unraveling the full extent of Whitmore's crimes, there was no time for shock or grief. The case was growing larger and more complex with each passing hour. The discovery of his hidden trophies had provided overwhelming evidence of his guilt, but it also presented an even more chilling possibility. If they had found the remains of 9 victims, how many more were still missing? The sheer organization of his journals suggested that Whitmore had been meticulous in his methods. He was not a man driven by impulse. He had planned every abduction, every murder, down to the finest detail. He had kept records of locations, of names, of the precise moments he had chosen to take his victims. And yet, even as investigators pored over the pages, they realized something horrifying. There were gaps in the entries. Missing dates. Unexplained pauses. The forensic team working at Whitmore's burial site in the dense Michigan woods continued to unearth more remains, each set of bones telling its own story of suffering and silence. By the end of the first week, the confirmed body count had risen to 13. But it wasn't enough to convict him of every crime. They needed undeniable proof, a confession, something that would ensure that Whitmore could never escape the justice he so richly deserved. Whitmore himself, however, was proving to be a difficult man to break. In the interrogation room, he remained unerringly composed. He did not protest his innocence, nor did he offer any explanations. When the detectives confronted him with the evidence, the journals, the remains, the trophies, he would simply nod, as if acknowledging their existence but refusing to engage. The only time he reacted at all was when they mentioned the possibility of others. "There are more, aren't there?" one of the detectives had asked, leaning forward, watching for the smallest shift in Whitmore's expression. "We know this doesn't end with 13. We know there are more graves, more names, more families waiting for answers." For the first time since his arrest, Whitmore had looked up. He had met the detective's gaze with an expression that was neither smug nor remorseful, but something far worse, calculated indifference. "You'll never find them all," he had said, his voice smooth, almost eerily calm. That single sentence sent a shiver through the room. It was not a denial. It was a challenge. The investigation expanded, teams of officers and forensic experts scouring the forests, the abandoned properties Whitmore had once owned, the rural stretches of land where he had often been seen driving late at night. But the search was slow, the cold winter months making excavation difficult. Every time they thought they had uncovered his last victim, another grave would be found, buried beneath layers of frost and forgotten time. As the legal proceedings against Whitmore began, the prosecution faced the difficult task of ensuring that he would never walk free again. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, but the true horror of his crimes lay not just in the number of his victims, but in the cruel efficiency with which he had carried them out. He had been careful. He had chosen his victims from the shadows, people who were unlikely to be immediately missed, transients, young travelers, those who had no one waiting for them back home. The trial was one of the most highly publicized in Michigan's history. Journalists from across the country descended upon Traverse City, desperate to understand how a man could live among his neighbors for so long without raising suspicion. The townspeople, once eager to defend Whitmore as a hard-working member of their community, now avoided even speaking his name. Some refused to believe he was capable of such atrocities, clinging to the idea that the police had made some terrible mistake. But as the prosecution laid out their case, presenting the grisly evidence in court, the reality became impossible to deny. The most damning piece of evidence was the journal, pages upon pages of chillingly detailed accounts of each abduction. Whitmore had recorded everything, from the moment he had chosen his victims to the final breath they had taken. He had noted their struggles, their cries for help, their desperate pleas for mercy, and in all of it, not once had he expressed regret. The words on the page were those of a man who saw his actions as nothing more than a routine, a necessary part of his existence. When the jury returned with their verdict, there was no hesitation. Guilty on all counts. As the judge sentenced Whitmore to life without the possibility of parole, the courtroom remained silent. There were no cheers of victory, no sense of relief. Because even as he was led away in shackles, there was an undeniable truth hanging over everyone in that room. He had won. Not in the sense of escaping justice, but in the knowledge that he had taken his secrets with him. That somewhere, deep in the forests of Michigan, there were still bodies waiting to be found. That even in his absence, the ghosts of his crimes would linger, haunting the land long after his name was forgotten. And as he sat in his prison cell that night, staring at the blank walls that would be his home for the rest of his days, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips. Because he knew something they didn't. There were still more, and they would never find them. Months passed since Samuel Whitmore's sentencing, but the town of Traverse City remained trapped in a silent, suffocating unease. It wasn't enough that he had been found guilty. It wasn't enough that he would die behind bars. There was still the unresolved horror of the missing, the unnamed, the ones who had never been reported, who had simply disappeared into the vast, unyielding wilderness of northern Michigan, their bodies never to be recovered. The police continued their search, combing through acres of dense forests, dredging nearby lakes, and following the few remaining clues left behind in Whitmore's journals. But despite their relentless efforts, the deeper they dug, the more elusive the answers became. It was as if Whitmore had anticipated this, as if he had deliberately left just enough evidence to implicate himself, but not enough to grant closure. He had taunted them, led them through a maze of half-truths and misdirections, ensuring that even in his downfall, he remained in control. And so Traverse City tried to move on. Businesses reopened, schools resumed, and people forced themselves to forget the shadow that had loomed over them for so long. But it was impossible to ignore the scars. The families who had lost loved ones would never find peace, never receive the solace of a proper burial. The houses near Whitmore's store stood eerily empty, many of them abandoned, their owners unwilling to live so close to a place that had once been nothing more than a hardware shop, but had now become a landmark of terror. The store itself had been closed indefinitely, its windows boarded up, the sign above its entrance still bearing Whitmore's name, though now it was covered in layers of graffiti, each message a reminder of the town's hatred for the man who had betrayed them. Some wanted the building demolished, others suggested turning it into a memorial, but no one could agree on how to properly erase the stain of his crimes. And then one day the nightmares began. It started with the children. Parents whispered about strange dreams, about their sons and daughters waking in the middle of the night, screaming about a man in the woods. They spoke of shadowy figures standing outside their windows, of cold hands reaching for them in their sleep. The police dismissed it at first. After all, the town had been through trauma, and it was only natural for fear to manifest in strange ways. But then, the adults started seeing things too. People claimed they saw Whitmore walking the streets at night, his gaunt face peering through alleyways, his hollow eyes watching from the darkness. Others reported hearing voices near the old hardware store, soft, pleading voices, as if the missing were trying to speak from beyond the grave. At first, the police believed it was nothing more than paranoia. But then, an officer on patrol saw something he couldn't explain. It was late, past midnight. He had been driving his usual route when he spotted a figure standing at the edge of the woods near Whitmore's property. Assuming it was a trespasser, he pulled over, stepping out with a flashlight in hand. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, half hidden among the trees. The officer called out, warning that he was law enforcement. Still, the figure didn't respond. But as the officer stepped closer, his heart froze. The man standing before him was Samuel Whitmore. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Whitmore was in prison. He had seen him taken away in shackles. He had heard the judge condemn him to life without parole. And yet, here he was, standing in the darkness, his eyes cold and empty, a twisted smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The officer staggered back, his pulse pounding in his ears. He fumbled for his radio, but the static that greeted him sent a fresh wave of terror down his spine. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. The incident was brushed aside, labeled as stress-induced hallucination, but others soon began reporting similar sightings. Some swore they saw Whitmore's face in the windows of abandoned houses. Others claimed to hear footsteps behind them at night, only to turn and find nothing. It wasn't long before the town fell into a quiet panic, with people locking their doors earlier than usual, unwilling to be outside after sundown. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed that Whitmore had died in prison, and his spirit had returned to haunt the town. Others were convinced that he had left behind some kind of evil presence, something far worse than the man himself. But there were a few who suggested something even more terrifying. What if he hadn't been working alone? It was an idea the police had considered before, but no evidence had ever surfaced to suggest that Whitmore had an accomplice. Yet, the thought lingered. If there was someone else out there, someone who had helped him, someone who had continued his work, it would explain the strange occurrences, the eerie sightings, the feeling that even though Whitmore was locked away, the horror was far from over. Then, a chilling discovery reignited the investigation. A group of hikers, unaware of the town's tragic history, had wandered deep into the woods one afternoon, following an old, overgrown path. They had planned to camp for the night, but as they searched for a clearing, one of them stumbled upon something half buried in the dirt. It was a box, a rusted, weathered container, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, they found something that made their blood run cold: photographs. Photographs of Whitmore's victims. But these weren't the same pictures the police had recovered from his store. These were new. Different angles, different settings. Some showed faces that had never been identified, people who had never even been listed as missing. And at the bottom of the box, scrawled in Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting, was a single message: "You will never know how deep this goes." The hikers wasted no time contacting the authorities, and within hours, the scene was swarming with officers. The box was taken in as evidence, the photos analyzed, the area thoroughly searched. But no other clues were found. No additional remains. No proof of where the missing victims had gone. Still, it was enough to shake the case back open. If these photos had been hidden away, undiscovered until now, who had put them there? Had Whitmore stashed them before his arrest? Or had someone else placed them there long after he was locked up? The questions were endless, and as investigators dug deeper, they began to realize the horrifying truth. Whitmore's crimes had never truly ended. Whether it was an accomplice, a copycat, or something far more sinister, one thing was certain: the nightmare wasn't over. And somewhere, out in the darkness, someone was still watching. The discovery of the photographs sent shockwaves through the town once more. The idea that Whitmore might not have been acting alone was terrifying enough, but the possibility that his crimes were continuing, long after his imprisonment, was something no one wanted to accept. The authorities knew they had no choice but to reopen the investigation. The FBI was called in again, their behavioral analysts poring over every scrap of evidence, revisiting every interview, every recorded statement Whitmore had ever made. Local police went back over his known haunts, revisiting places they had long since combed through, hoping they had missed something, anything that could explain the presence of those photographs. And yet, the deeper they searched, the more they realized just how little they truly knew. For weeks, officers traced every known associate of Whitmore's, every customer who had frequented his hardware store, every drifter or stranger who had passed through town in the years leading up to his arrest. They questioned his former employees, old business contacts, even distant relatives who had long cut ties with him. But no one could offer anything substantial. No one had noticed anything suspicious, at least not enough to suspect that Whitmore had been working with someone else. Then another clue surfaced. A forensic analyst, going over the old case files, noticed something strange in one of the crime scene photos taken from Whitmore's basement. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable: a stack of old, tattered notebooks, some with pages torn out, others covered in indecipherable scribbles. The police had dismissed them as the ramblings of a madman, disorganized thoughts scrawled without any real coherence. But the analyst noticed something the original team had overlooked. In the margins of one of the notebooks, Whitmore had written something over and over again. A name: Jonah. It wasn't a name that had come up in any of the previous investigations. It wasn't the name of any known victims, nor was it connected to any of Whitmore's past acquaintances. At first, it seemed meaningless, perhaps a fabrication, a ghost conjured by Whitmore's fractured mind. But then, a deeper dive into the town's records revealed something chilling. Several years before Whitmore's arrest, a man named Jonah Briggs had moved to Traverse City. He had lived on the outskirts, in a secluded house near the woods, keeping mostly to himself. No criminal record, no known family, nothing to suggest he had ever been involved in anything illegal. He had worked a handful of odd jobs, but never stayed in one place for too long. Then, just months before Whitmore's arrest, Jonah had vanished. At the time, no one had paid much attention to his disappearance. He had been a quiet man, barely known to most, and since there were no signs of foul play, it was assumed he had simply left town. But now, with his name scrawled repeatedly in Whitmore's notes, the question arose: had Jonah Briggs truly disappeared, or had something far more sinister happened? The FBI wasted no time in searching for answers. They visited the property where Jonah had lived, only to find it had been abandoned for years. The house was in a state of decay, overgrown with weeds, the windows shattered, the walls covered in graffiti left behind by teenagers who had used it as a hangout. Inside, it was clear no one had lived there for a long time. Dust covered the floors, old newspapers sat untouched on the countertops, and a thick silence lingered in the air, as if the place had been frozen in time. But in the basement, they found something that made their blood run cold. Carved into the concrete walls were symbols, deep, jagged marks that looked as if they had been made with a knife or some other sharp instrument. They weren't letters, not in any language the investigators recognized. Instead, they were crude, chaotic etchings, layered on top of one another, as if someone had spent hours, days, even weeks carving them over and over again. And in the center of the room, standing alone amid the dust and decay, was an old wooden chair. Ropes still dangled from its arms and legs, their fibers stained dark with something that had long since dried. It was clear, something had happened here. Something terrible. The forensic team combed through every inch of the basement, searching for DNA, fingerprints, any clue that could confirm whether Jonah Briggs had been a victim of Whitmore's or something else entirely. But the results only deepened the mystery. There was no DNA matching Jonah anywhere in the house. In fact, there was barely any trace of him at all. No clothing, no personal belongings, nothing that indicated he had ever truly lived there. And yet, neighbors swore they had seen him. They remembered him walking the dirt roads at night, remembered the single light that always glowed from his basement window. Some recalled brief conversations, nothing more than polite small talk. But none of them had ever actually been inside his home. It was as if he had existed only on the surface, a shadow passing through, leaving behind no real proof of his presence. And then, an even more disturbing theory emerged. What if Jonah Briggs hadn't been one of Whitmore's victims? What if he had been his partner? The idea sent a new wave of terror through the town. The notion that Whitmore had not acted alone was already horrifying, but the possibility that his accomplice had been living among them, undetected, was even worse. And if Jonah had vanished just before Whitmore's arrest, there were only two possibilities. Either Whitmore had killed him to cover his tracks, or Jonah was still out there. The town spiraled into paranoia once more. People whispered about every stranger they passed, second-guessing their neighbors, wondering if the man who had once walked among them was still watching from the shadows. Doors were locked earlier than before, windows double-checked, security cameras installed on houses that had never needed them. And then, just as the fear was beginning to settle, a letter arrived at the local police station. No return address, no fingerprints, no indication of where it had come from. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, written in dark, jagged ink, were 5 words. You should have stopped looking. The case had just taken a new turn, and whoever Jonah Briggs was, he wanted them to know he was still in control. The letter sent a chill through the entire department. For a brief moment, the room was silent as the officers and detectives processed what they were seeing. The handwriting was erratic, the ink smeared in some places as if written in haste or with a trembling hand. There were no fingerprints, no fibers, no indication of who had sent it. The only thing they knew for sure was that someone out there was watching them, and they wanted the investigation to stop. But stopping was no longer an option. The FBI ordered an immediate forensic examination of the letter, testing it for any trace of DNA, any residue that might indicate where it had come from. Meanwhile, officers were dispatched to check security footage from the surrounding area, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had dropped it off. But once again, the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the reality became. There was no footage of anyone approaching the station at the time the letter must have been delivered. No suspicious figures, no vehicles that had stopped outside. It was as if the letter had appeared out of thin air. Then came another disturbing revelation. The handwriting on the letter, it didn't match Whitmore's. It also didn't match any known sample from Jonah Briggs. Whoever had written it was someone else entirely. For a long moment, the lead investigator, Special Agent Reynolds, stared at the note, his fingers tightening around its edges. There was something deeply personal about the message. It wasn't a warning sent to scare them off, it was a command. A statement made by someone who believed they had authority over this case. Someone who had been involved from the very beginning. That night, the tension in Traverse City was palpable. People whispered in hushed voices, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. News of the letter had leaked, spreading across town like wildfire. The thought that someone else, someone they had never suspected, was out there watching, sent shivers down their spines. Then, just as the town began to settle into a restless, uneasy silence, something else happened. Another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't sent to the police station. It was delivered directly to the home of Officer Derek Holloway. He had been one of the original investigators on the Whitmore case. A veteran of the force, he had seen his fair share of horror, but nothing had ever shaken him quite like this. He found the letter on his doorstep when he returned home from his shift. A plain, white envelope, no postage, no markings. Inside, the same jagged handwriting. Do you really want to know? For the first time in his long career, Officer Holloway felt fear grip him in a way he couldn't explain. He had seen murder, he had faced down criminals more times than he could count. But this was something different. This was someone playing a game. And the worst part, he had no idea who was on the other side of the board. Immediately, the letter was sent for analysis, but just like before, there was nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no sign of where it had come from. It was a ghost, just like the last one. But Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that it had been meant for him, specifically. That someone was testing him, or worse, mocking him. The FBI doubled down on their investigation, working around the clock to trace any potential leads. Every known associate of Whitmore was revisited. Every scrap of evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes. And then finally they found something. A single piece of evidence they had all missed. An old surveillance tape. One that had been sitting in the evidence locker for years, long forgotten among the hundreds of files from the Whitmore case. It had been recorded at a gas station just outside of Traverse City. The date? The night before Jonah Briggs had disappeared. At first, the footage seemed ordinary. Cars pulling in and out, customers filling their tanks, a bored cashier staring at his phone behind the counter. Then, at 2:37 a.m., a man appeared on the screen. Jonah Briggs. He was alone, his hoodie pulled up over his head, his face partially obscured. He walked to the ATM, withdrew a small sum of cash, then turned and headed toward the convenience store. But then, just before he entered the building, he stopped, and he looked over his shoulder. The camera angle was limited, only capturing his profile. But the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew he was being watched. Then, just seconds later, another figure entered the frame. A man. Tall. Thin. Dressed in dark clothing. His face never fully visible, always just outside the camera's range. He followed Jonah into the store. The footage continued for several more minutes. Jonah made his purchases, just a bottle of water and a pack of gum, then walked back outside. And the man followed. The last thing the camera captured was Jonah getting into his car, and the man getting into the passenger seat beside him. The car pulled away. Jonah Briggs was never seen again. The room went silent as the footage ended. There was no audio, no way to know what was said between them. But one thing was now certain. Jonah Briggs hadn't just disappeared. He had left with someone. And whoever that person was, they had never been caught. Special Agent Reynolds leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Everything they thought they knew about this case had just been shattered. Whitmore had never mentioned an accomplice. Jonah Briggs had never been confirmed as a victim. And now, years later, someone was sending them letters. Someone who still had a vested interest in making sure the truth never came to light. The question was no longer just about what had happened in the past. The question was, what was coming next? The days that followed were filled with a relentless sense of unease. Every officer in Traverse City knew something was wrong, something much bigger than they had ever imagined. The past was no longer buried. It was clawing its way back to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. The letters, the footage, the lingering questions, none of it made sense. Jonah Briggs had vanished without a trace all those years ago, presumed dead, another ghost lost to time. But if he had left willingly with someone that night, if he had stepped into that car on his own, then what had really happened to him? And why was someone so determined to keep them from finding out? Agent Reynolds spent hours reviewing the footage, studying every frame, searching for any small detail they might have missed. The gas station's grainy security camera didn't offer much clarity, but it was enough to confirm one thing. The man who had gotten into the car with Jonah was not Edward Whitmore, which meant Whitmore had lied. About everything. The realization sent a ripple of frustration through the team. For years, they had believed the case had been solved, that the nightmare was over. Whitmore had been convicted based on evidence that now seemed incomplete at best, fabricated at worst. If he hadn't been working alone, if Jonah had willingly entered that vehicle, then who else had been involved? And where was Jonah now? The first step was clear. They needed to question Whitmore again. The visit to Whitmore's prison was unlike any before. The man who had once been so eager to talk, so desperate to relive the horrors he had inflicted, now sat in silence, staring blankly at the wall. He had aged in the years since his conviction, his hair thinner, his frame frilier, but the cold emptiness in his eyes had not faded. Agent Reynolds placed the letter on the table between them. "We know you had help," he said, his voice steady. "And we know you've been lying from the start." Whitmore's gaze flickered to the paper, his lips curling into something that was neither a smile nor a frown, just a faint, knowing expression. "Help," he mused, his voice raspier than before. "Is that what you think?" Reynolds didn't respond. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the accusation settle. Whitmore exhaled a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. His fingers tapped against the metal table, rhythmic, deliberate. Then at last he spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts, Agent?" Reynolds felt a chill crawl up his spine. He wasn't in the mood for riddles. Whitmore chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Of course you don't. You're a man of logic, facts, evidence. But some things—" He trailed off, his gaze distant. "Some things don't leave a trace. Some things slip through the cracks, like whispers in the dark." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "Where is Jonah Briggs?" Whitmore tilted his head, watching him with something almost like amusement. "You think I know?" he asked. "After all this time?" "You knew him," Reynolds pressed. "You lured him in. You were the last known person to contact him before he disappeared. But we have proof that he wasn't alone that night. So I'll ask again, who was with him?" A long pause. Then Whitmore smiled. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Reynolds fought the urge to slam his fist against the table. This wasn't getting anywhere. Whitmore was playing games, the same way he always had. But there was something different this time. A flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear. Not fear of getting caught, not fear of losing control. Something deeper. Something real. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "You're afraid," he said, testing the theory. "Not of us. Not of prison. But of whoever helped you back then. You think they're still out there, don't you?" Whitmore's smile faltered. Just for a second. Then, before Reynolds could press further, the man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If you dig too deep," he whispered, "you won't like what you find." Reynolds held his gaze. "I don't scare easy." Whitmore chuckled again, shaking his head. "No," he agreed. "But maybe you should." The visit ended without any real answers. But Reynolds left with something far more unsettling. A feeling. A cold, creeping certainty that whatever had happened to Jonah Briggs, whatever truth lay buried beneath years of silence, it was worse than they had ever imagined. And someone somewhere was still watching, still waiting. And they weren't done yet. Case 5. In the late summer of 1998, under the sweltering Nevada sun, a man named Robert Bobby Calloway became a ghost. Not in the literal sense, but in a way that law enforcement found just as perplexing. He managed to weave himself into the fabric of the desert, leaving behind only whispers of his existence. Bobby Calloway was an enigma, a man with no past, no future, and no clear purpose other than surviving by whatever means necessary. He had no birth records, no employment history, and no known family. What he did have, however, was an uncanny ability to blend in, to slip through the cracks unnoticed. For years, he roamed the outskirts of Las Vegas, moving between transient motels and rundown trailer parks, taking odd jobs when needed, disappearing when necessary. People who met him rarely remembered him beyond the brief transactions they shared. A mechanic who once fixed his car, a bartender who served him whiskey on a lonely night, a pawnshop owner who bought a watch from him that wasn't his to sell. But in the fall of 1998, everything changed. Bobby Calloway did something that would ensure he would never be forgotten. The first body was found on the outskirts of Henderson, near an abandoned gas station long since reclaimed by the desert. A hitchhiker, a young woman in her early 20s, her identity unknown. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma, but what puzzled investigators was the meticulous way her body had been arranged. Arms crossed over her chest, her hair neatly brushed, and a single playing card tucked into the pocket of her jeans. The Jack of Spades. The second body was discovered 2 weeks later, just outside of Reno. Another transient, a man in his 30s, found in a similar state, cleaned, posed, with a card placed in his coat pocket. The Queen of Hearts. Law enforcement quickly realized they had something far worse than a random killing spree on their hands. There was a pattern, a method, a silent message being sent with each new victim. The media, ever hungry for a sensational name, dubbed the unknown killer the Blackjack Butcher. Bobby Calloway, of course, wasn't his only name. Over the years, he had gone by many aliases: Paul Anderson, Jimmy Redfield, Marcus Dean. But Bobby was the name he had used the longest. It was the name he had been using when he first stepped into Nevada, a state that promised anonymity to those who knew how to take it. The murders stretched across the state, from the dusty backroads of Elko to the neon glow of downtown Las Vegas. Each crime scene was nearly identical. The victims chosen seemingly at random, their bodies handled with an eerie reverence, and always, without fail, a playing card left behind. Law enforcement scrambled for leads. They scoured security footage, interrogated anyone with a history of violence, and even entertained the possibility that they were dealing with an ex-casino worker, using some twisted metaphor to send a message. But no one had an answer. The break came on an evening in early December, when a security guard at a bus station in Carson City noticed a man loitering near the vending machines. Something about him was off, the way he stood too still, the way his eyes flicked back and forth as if searching for something unseen. The guard approached, intending to ask for identification. The man turned, and that was when the guard saw it. A single playing card peeking out of his jacket pocket. The King of Diamonds. By the time law enforcement arrived, Bobby Calloway was gone. But now, for the first time, they had a face. Security footage captured his movements, a lean figure mid-40s, graying at the temples but still sharp, still dangerous. He had always been careful, always one step ahead. But now, for the first time, he had left behind something he couldn't take back. His own image. The image of Bobby Calloway's face circulated through law enforcement agencies across Nevada, then across the country. But despite this newfound advantage, the investigation remained frustratingly stagnant. A face without a name, a suspect without a past. Bobby had spent years perfecting the art of vanishing, and now, even with the eyes of the state upon him, he seemed to disappear once again, slipping into the cracks between cities like a shadow at dusk. Detectives traced his movements as far as they could. They studied the security footage from the bus station, watching as he left through the rear exit, vanishing into the night. They pulled records of recent transactions, scoured motels for any sign of him, and questioned anyone who might have seen a man matching his description. But Bobby was a ghost. He had no credit cards, no registered vehicle, no property in his name. The only thing he left behind were bodies and playing cards, each one carrying a silent, mocking message. Then, 2 weeks later, another body appeared. This time, it was found in a small, nearly forgotten town outside of Winnemucca. A drifter, middle-aged, no known connections to the previous victims. But the scene was the same, carefully arranged, meticulously staged, with a single card tucked into his shirt pocket. The ace of clubs. The message was clear. Bobby Calloway had not stopped. He was still moving, still playing his game. And now, he was taunting them. The FBI became involved, sending profilers and forensic experts to analyze the pattern of his killings. They debated his motives. Was he a former gambler, someone with a vendetta against the transient community, or was there a deeper meaning behind the cards? The playing card motif suggested something deliberate, a calculated methodology rather than random violence. Some believed the numbers on the cards might hold significance, that they were counting down to something. Others speculated that the suits represented categories, perhaps hearts for women, spades for men, clubs for those who fought back. But there was no discernible pattern among the victims themselves. They weren't connected by profession, appearance, or lifestyle. The only common thread was that they were alone when they died, isolated from the world, easy targets. As the days turned into weeks, panic spread. People traveling alone through Nevada grew wary. News stations ran segments on the so-called Blackjack Butcher, warning residents to stay vigilant, to avoid hitchhiking, to be cautious of strangers. Casinos in Las Vegas even started monitoring their card decks more closely, as if somehow expecting the killer to leave his mark there next. But Bobby was never one to linger where people were watching. He thrived in the places no one cared to look, in the forgotten gas stations along empty highways, the motels where no one asked for ID, the dusty trailer parks on the fringes of existence. He lived in the spaces between law and lawlessness, a drifter by nature, a predator by necessity. Investigators focused on his habits, trying to predict his next move. He seemed to favor small towns, places where his presence wouldn't draw attention. They anticipated where he might strike next, sending undercover officers to stake out known hitchhiking routes, patrolling abandoned lots, waiting. And then, just when they thought they were closing in, he changed the game. A letter arrived at the Nevada State Police headquarters. No return address, no fingerprints, nothing that could be traced. Inside, a single playing card, the Joker. No body, no victim, just a message. Bobby was watching them. and he was daring them to keep up. The arrival of the Joker card shifted everything. It was no longer just a string of murders. This was now a calculated game of control, a battle of wits between a faceless predator and the law enforcement agencies struggling to catch him. The FBI had seen taunts like this before, but something about Bobby Calloway's methods unsettled them. He wasn't just trying to scare the police or feed his own ego. He was playing with them, moving pieces across an invisible chessboard, dictating the pace of the investigation as if he already knew their next move. Agents analyzed the card for clues, searching for any microscopic fibers, any trace of ink, any distinguishing marks that could lead them to where it had been purchased. But Bobby was meticulous. If there was a mistake, it wasn't in plain sight. The profilers debated the meaning of the Joker. Did it signify a turning point, a warning, or was it simply another way to mock them? Some believed it meant Bobby was preparing for something bigger, perhaps escalating his crimes or changing his pattern entirely. Others feared it was a declaration of victory, a sign that he had already won. But they didn't have time to debate for long. 3 days after the card arrived, another body was found. This time it was different. The victim was an officer. Deputy Marshal Greg Stanton had been part of the task force tracking Bobby Calloway for weeks. He had last been seen leaving his house late in the evening, reportedly heading to a nearby diner. But he never made it there. His patrol car was found abandoned in a vacant lot on the outskirts of Reno, the driver's side door left wide open. They found his body a mile away, propped up against an old billboard, his gun still in its holster. A playing card was tucked neatly into the front pocket of his uniform. The King of Hearts. The meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't just another kill. This was personal. The message was clear. Bobby had been watching them. He had followed one of their own, waited for the perfect moment to strike, and left a mark that couldn't be ignored. Fear turned into desperation. Law enforcement ramped up their efforts, flooding the state with officers, roadblocks, and undercover agents. The governor approved emergency measures, allowing for extended surveillance operations and unrestricted access to state databases. Highways were patrolled day and night, hotels were raided, and security footage from every gas station, truck stop, and diner in a 100-mile radius was reviewed. But Bobby was still a ghost. Then, the break they had been waiting for arrived. An old motel clerk in Elko reported seeing a man matching Bobby's description checking in under a fake name. He had paid in cash, kept his head down, and stayed for just one night before disappearing. But he had made a mistake. He had left behind a single cigarette, but in the ashtray by the nightstand. Forensics ran the DNA against their database, and the results came back in less than 12 hours. Robert Calloway, born in 1979, raised in a small town in Montana. Arrested twice as a juvenile for petty theft. No known employment history. No living family members. No official record past the age of 23. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself from existence. But now they had something solid. A name. A past. A trail, however faint, leading back to the man who had been playing with them like pieces on a board. They traced his movements backward, mapping out every location where a similar murder had occurred. The pattern wasn't random. It followed a route, a twisted road that weaved through forgotten towns, abandoned highways, and desolate landscapes. It wasn't just about killing. Bobby was moving with purpose, and now they had to figure out where he was going next. Because one thing was certain, he wasn't finished. And if they didn't stop him soon, the next body wouldn't be left with just a playing card. It would be left with something far worse. The weight of the discovery settled over the task force like a storm cloud. They had a name, a history, and a pattern, but still Bobby Calloway was out there, moving freely just one step ahead. The playing cards weren't just his signature, they were a warning. A game piece placed with deliberate intent. But what was the endgame? What was he building toward? The search intensified. Federal agencies poured resources into tracking his last known movements, studying every possible road he could have taken. Maps were pinned with red strings, tracing a jagged path across the barren Nevada landscape. It was no longer just about finding Bobby, it was about understanding him. They revisited the crime scenes, looking for anything they had missed. Every victim had been chosen carefully, each one fitting a pattern they were only beginning to grasp. He wasn't killing at random, nor was he simply indulging in chaos. There was an order to his madness, a structure to his violence. Then another lead surfaced. A gas station surveillance tape from a town just outside Ely showed a man resembling Bobby buying supplies. A map, canned food, a jerrycan of fuel. He moved with the same calculated manner as before, his face partially obscured by a hood. But there was something different this time. He was nervous, jittery, as if he knew the walls were closing in. The timestamp placed him there only 24 hours before the body of Greg Stanton had been found. He wasn't just covering his tracks. He was planning something new, something bigger. Law enforcement scrambled to determine his next move. Where was he heading? Then they found it. A small, abandoned mining town deep in the Nevada desert. A ghost town forgotten by time, barely more than a few crumbling buildings and rusted-out vehicles. But it wasn't just any town. It was the place Bobby Calloway had been born, or at least where the trail of his past led them. Investigators uncovered property records dating back decades, revealing an old family home registered under his mother's name. It had been left to decay after her death, untouched for years. But something about it didn't sit right. Why would he return there? Unless he had never really left. The decision was made. A raid team was assembled. They moved fast, mobilizing under the cover of darkness, cutting off all possible escape routes. Every agent knew the risk. Bobby had evaded capture for years, slipping through the cracks like a ghost. But ghosts don't stay hidden forever. As they approached the desolate town, the wind howled through empty streets, whipping up dust and debris. The air was thick with an eerie silence, as if the land itself held its breath. Then, a single light flickered in the distance. A lone cabin stood at the edge of town, its windows glowing dimly in the night. He was there, waiting. The team moved in, surrounding the structure with precision, weapons drawn, voices steady. They expected a fight. They were ready for anything. But what they found inside was something none of them could have anticipated. The walls were lined with newspaper clippings, articles about his own crimes, each one meticulously marked with red ink. Strings connected photographs, creating a spiderweb of connections, leading to one central image pinned in the middle of the room, his own face. On the table, a deck of cards lay spread out, the Joker resting on top. And in the corner, slumped in an old wooden chair, was Bobby Calloway. Still, motionless, a single gunshot wound to the temple. A final act, a closing move in the game he had orchestrated. But as the agents stood there, absorbing the scene, a cold realization crept over them. This wasn't the end. Not yet, because on the table, beneath the cards, was a list. A list of names. Names of people still alive. And beside each one was a single chilling mark. A date. A time. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The room was thick with the scent of dust and decay, the air heavy with a silence that felt almost unnatural. The agents stood frozen, their breaths slow and measured, as if any sudden movement might disturb something unseen. The dim light from a single flickering bulb overhead cast long, wavering shadows against the walls, illuminating the chaos Bobby Calloway had left behind. His lifeless body sat in the chair, head tilted slightly to the side, a trickle of blood running down from the wound at his temple. His right hand still clutched the revolver, a final punctuation mark to the violent symphony he had composed over the years. But the real horror wasn't the body. It was the list, a crumpled, yellowing piece of paper, weathered from age and handling, covered in names. Each one carefully written in bold, slanted script. Some had been crossed out, others remained untouched, but beside every single name was a date. Some from the past, some still to come. There were more victims, more people marked for death. And Bobby Calloway had planned for it all. The lead agent, his face pale under the dim light, reached for the list, his gloved fingers trembling slightly as he smoothed it out on the table. The names blurred together for a moment, his mind struggling to process the weight of what he was seeing. Then one name stood out, a name that shouldn't have been there, a name that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. It was one of their own, a member of the task force, marked for tomorrow. Panic rippled through the team like a shockwave. Radios crackled to life, voices urgent and sharp as orders were issued, calls made. But deep down, they all knew the clock was already ticking. Bobby Calloway might have been dead, but his game wasn't over. Someone else was still playing, and they were already one step ahead. The search intensified. They combed through every inch of the cabin, turning over furniture, pulling open drawers, searching for anything, any clue, any hint, that might lead them to whoever was continuing Bobby's work. But the room was a carefully curated shrine to his own legacy. There were maps, old photographs, newspaper clippings dating back decades. And then they found it, tucked away in a metal box beneath the floorboards, a collection of letters. Letters written in Bobby's own hand. But not just any letters. Correspondence. Conversations. With someone who knew him intimately. Someone who understood his methods. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. The letters were cryptic, filled with half-truths and veiled messages. But one thing was clear. Bobby Calloway hadn't been working alone. He had a partner. And that partner was still out there. Waiting. Watching. Ready to take over where Bobby had left off. The realization sent a chill through the team. They had been so focused on catching Bobby, so consumed by his crimes, that they had overlooked the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one man. This was something larger. Something deeper. And now, with Bobby gone, the real monster was about to step out of the shadows. The letters provided a name, though it was impossible to tell if it was real, or just another game piece in a puzzle that had yet to be solved. But the handwriting was eerily similar to Bobby's, the tone just as methodical, just as precise. Whoever this person was, they had been studying Bobby for years, learning from him, waiting for their turn. And now it had arrived. The list of names was no longer just a record of Bobby's past victims. It was a hit list, a blueprint for the next phase, and they were already running out of time. As the agents stared at the letters, the weight of their discovery settling over them like a suffocating fog, a single realization cut through the chaos. Bobby Calloway's story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. The agents stood in the dimly lit room, their faces frozen in a mixture of exhaustion and realization. The gravity of what they had uncovered pressed heavily on their shoulders. Bobby Calloway had been a monster, a killer without remorse, but he had not been acting alone. His letters revealed a deeper darkness, a force still at large, operating in the shadows. The truth was far worse than they had imagined. This wasn't just one man's madness. This was something bigger, something that had roots stretching further than they could see. The clock was ticking, and they were running out of time. The name on the list, one of their own, sent a fresh wave of urgency through the team. If Bobby's partner was still following the plan, then the next murder was only hours away. Every second mattered. They couldn't afford hesitation, couldn't allow the shock of their discovery to slow them down. The lead investigator, Special Agent Daniel Mercer, clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had spent years chasing Bobby Calloway, had built his entire career on tracking the man down. But now, as he stood in the aftermath of Bobby's death, he realized he had only been playing into a larger scheme. The real enemy was still out there. Mercer's hands trembled as he flipped through the letters, scanning the words with growing unease. Bobby's partner had been careful, deliberate. There were no direct references, no obvious admissions. Just cryptic sentences woven between the lines, hinting at a connection that ran far deeper than anyone had realized. And then, buried near the bottom of the stack, Mercer found it. A date. Not a past crime. Not a name on the list. A future event. The letters spoke of the final act, a culmination of everything Bobby and his partner had worked toward, and that event was set to happen in just 3 days. The weight of the revelation hit Mercer like a freight train. They weren't just dealing with a continuation of Bobby's murders. They were looking at something much worse. Something orchestrated, planned. Something designed to leave an impact far greater than a single death. This wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. Bobby had been preparing for this moment long before they had ever caught up to him. He had been laying the groundwork for something bigger than himself. And now, even in death, his plan was still moving forward. Mercer's mind reeled as he tried to piece it all together. The letters, the list, the cryptic references to a grand finale. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. This was a mass event, not a single killing. A massacre. Case 6. Liu Jianhong had always been a quiet man. Born in the industrial outskirts of Guangzhou in the late 1970s, his life was marked by a stillness that many mistook for patience. He spoke little, observed much, and worked diligently at whatever task was given to him. As a child, he excelled in mathematics but never pursued higher education. Instead, he found himself drawn into the world of logistics, an industry that kept China's vast manufacturing empire running. By his mid-30s, he had become a mid-level manager at a major shipping company, overseeing the transportation of goods across the country and beyond. He was unremarkable to his colleagues, just another face in a sea of workers who kept the economy moving. But behind that quiet exterior lay something far more sinister. Liu had spent years studying the intricacies of China's supply chain. He understood how shipments moved, where weak points in security existed, and how to manipulate digital records without drawing attention. He knew which ports had lax inspections and which warehouses were seldom checked. His mind, methodical and precise, absorbed every detail. But it wasn't until 2012 that he saw an opportunity, one that would lead to the largest criminal operation China had ever witnessed. It began with a single container. A shipment of consumer electronics had arrived at the port of Tianjin, bound for markets in Europe. Lu, through his network of contacts, had arranged for the container to be diverted for a brief stop at a privately owned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The delay was minimal, just a few hours. The contents were untouched, the seals carefully reapplied, and the shipment proceeded as scheduled. But hidden within the legitimate goods were items that weren't supposed to be there. Counterfeit microchips, nearly identical to the originals. The scheme was ingenious. China was the global hub for electronics manufacturing, and the demand for cheaper components was insatiable. The difference between an authentic microchip and a counterfeit one could mean millions in profit. But while counterfeiting was nothing new, Lu's approach was unique. Rather than flooding the market with obviously inferior products, he sourced nearly perfect replicas. Chips that functioned just well enough to pass initial inspections. They found their way into everything from smartphones to military equipment, spreading unnoticed. What had started as a small operation quickly grew. Lu established connections with factories that specialized in near-identical reproductions, paying off key individuals to ensure quality. His network expanded beyond China, reaching as far as Russia, Southeast Asia, and even the United States. He developed a method of moving these goods through a labyrinth of shell companies and fake invoices, ensuring that no single shipment could be traced directly back to him. The profits were astronomical, but greed has a way of making even the most careful criminals reckless. In 2016, Lu's operation took a dangerous turn. He had long avoided dealing in restricted goods, keeping his activities confined to commercial electronics. But one of his contacts introduced him to a group looking for something far more sensitive: military-grade components. The global arms trade was a lucrative, shadowy business, and for Lu, it was an opportunity too tempting to ignore. Through a series of intermediaries, he arranged for shipments of counterfeit semiconductors to be sold to defense contractors in multiple countries. These weren't just any components. They were vital parts used in radar systems, missile guidance, and communications equipment. The implications were staggering. A faulty chip in a civilian device was one thing, but in a fighter jet or a nuclear submarine, it could mean disaster. For a while, the scheme continued unnoticed. But in 2017, reports of critical system failures in newly manufactured military equipment began to surface. Engineers traced the issue back to compromised microchips, and soon, intelligence agencies were investigating. The web of transactions was intricate, but mistakes had been made. A small discrepancy in a shipping manifest, a misfiled invoice, tiny cracks in an otherwise flawless operation. Lu's network was vast, but now it was being unraveled. The Chinese government, recognizing the potential embarrassment of the situation, launched a covert investigation. The scale of the operation shocked even the most seasoned officials. Billions of yuan had been funneled through offshore accounts. Military secrets had been compromised. The very infrastructure of global security had been undermined by one man's greed. And yet, Lu remained elusive. By the time authorities closed in, he had already disappeared. His bank accounts were emptied, his properties abandoned. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Some believed he had fled to Southeast Asia. Others suspected he had assumed a new identity in Europe. But as months turned into years, no trace of him was ever found. The scandal sent shockwaves through the global supply chain. Governments tightened regulations, corporations scrambled to secure their suppliers, and intelligence agencies worked tirelessly to prevent a repeat of Lu's operation. But the truth was undeniable. He had exposed a vulnerability that could never be fully sealed. To this day, no one knows where Lu Jianhong is. His empire may have crumbled, but his legacy remains, a stark reminder of how one man, armed with nothing more than knowledge and patience, could shake the foundations of an entire industry. Lu Jianhong's disappearance left more questions than answers. In the months following the discovery of his vast counterfeit empire, Chinese authorities launched an extensive manhunt. They raided warehouses, seized assets, and interrogated dozens of individuals who had worked under him. Yet despite their efforts, Lu himself remained an enigma. The last confirmed sighting of him was at a private airstrip outside of Shenzhen, where surveillance footage captured a man resembling him boarding a small aircraft bound for an unknown destination. The records for the flight were later found to be falsified. No pilot logs, no passenger lists, just another layer of deception in a career built on misdirection. But while Lu had seemingly vanished, the consequences of his actions continued to unfold. In early 2018, reports surfaced of widespread failures in critical infrastructure projects across multiple countries. Power grids, telecommunications networks, and transportation systems were all experiencing mysterious malfunctions. Investigations revealed a common thread: faulty microchips, all of which could be traced back to factories that had been under Lu's influence. The realization sent shockwaves through the global tech industry. Governments scrambled to assess the damage, corporations rushed to replace compromised components, and intelligence agencies speculated about the long-term implications. Had Lu intentionally introduced vulnerabilities into these systems as a form of sabotage? Or was it merely a byproduct of his greed, an unintended consequence of cutting corners in pursuit of profit? The uncertainty was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of it all. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies around the world remained fixated on tracking Lu down. China had placed him at the top of its most wanted list, but they were not alone in their pursuit. The United States, the European Union, and several Southeast Asian nations had all issued warrants for his arrest, each citing different aspects of his crimes. Yet for all their resources, they found themselves chasing a ghost. Some believed he had fled to South America, where corrupt officials could be bribed into looking the other way. Others theorized he had hidden in plain sight, living under an assumed identity in a remote Chinese village, far from the reach of international law enforcement. A few even suggested that he had met a more sinister fate, that the very people who had once profited from his schemes had decided he was now a liability. But one thing was certain: his empire, though dismantled, had not been entirely eradicated. Despite the arrests of several high-ranking members of his network, new counterfeit electronics continued to surface in markets around the world. It was clear that Lu's absence had not stopped the machine he had built. It had merely forced it to adapt. Smaller, more discreet operations had taken root, each learning from the mistakes that had led to their predecessor's downfall. If anything, the crackdown had made them more cautious, more resilient. And so, the hunt for Lu Jianhong became more than just a pursuit of justice. It became a battle against an idea, a war against a system that had grown beyond any single individual. As months turned into years, public interest in the case began to wane. New scandals, new crises took center stage, and Lu's name gradually faded from headlines. Yet for those who had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice, the search never truly ended. Somewhere out there, they believed, he was still watching, still waiting. The longer Lu Jianhong remained in the shadows, the more his legend grew. He became a ghost story whispered in the corridors of intelligence agencies, a cautionary tale for young detectives learning the trade, and a symbol of unchecked ambition in corporate boardrooms. His name surfaced in underground forums, where cybercriminals speculated about his whereabouts, and in news articles analyzing the lasting impact of his counterfeit empire. Some said he had undergone reconstructive surgery, altering his face to avoid recognition. Others believed he had fled to a country with no extradition treaty, living under the protection of those who still profited from his deception. Years passed, but the effects of his crimes remained. Countries continued to uncover compromised electronic components in their infrastructure. Governments quietly funneled billions into replacing tainted systems, but every time they thought they had eradicated his influence, another batch of counterfeit microchips would surface, hidden among legitimate shipments. It was as if Lu's ghost still haunted the global supply chain, his legacy impossible to erase. The failures were no longer limited to consumer goods. Military-grade equipment had been compromised. Fighter jets, naval systems, and missile defense networks relied on components that could not be trusted. Engineers scrambled to audit and replace every suspect part, but the sheer scale of the contamination made it an impossible task. Entire defense contracts had to be rewritten, cybersecurity teams worked around the clock, and intelligence agencies feared the worst. What if Lu had designed a way to remotely disable or manipulate these systems? The possibility alone was enough to send shivers through the highest levels of government. Despite the secrecy surrounding these efforts, leaked reports occasionally made their way to the press. A naval destroyer experiencing unexplained malfunctions, a satellite failing mid-mission, a stock market flash crash triggered by an unexpected data error. Each event fed speculation that Lu's work had not yet been undone. The Chinese government, still haunted by the embarrassment of his escape, remained tight-lipped on the matter. But those who had worked on the case knew the truth. The consequences of Lu's empire were still unfolding. And then, in the winter of 2025, a breakthrough came. A routine raid in Bangkok, targeting an unrelated cybercrime syndicate, uncovered a series of encrypted messages. Among them was a single reference to a name that had not been seen in official records for years, Jianhong. Investigators quickly traced the messages to a secure server located in an upscale district of Dubai. The contents were vague, but one line stood out. "The old man is moving." It was the first concrete lead in nearly a decade. Interpol, the FBI, and Chinese intelligence agencies converged on Dubai, deploying undercover operatives to surveil the city's high-end hotels, financial centers, and exclusive clubs. They monitored flight records, bank transactions, and digital communications, searching for any sign of their elusive target. Days turned into weeks, but then, just as they began to lose hope, an anomaly appeared. A man using a falsified Hong Kong passport had checked into a private villa under the name of a deceased businessman. Security footage revealed only brief glimpses of him, but the posture, the way he carried himself, it was enough to raise suspicions. His movements were meticulous, his interactions limited. He never used public Wi-Fi, never made direct calls, never left a digital footprint. It was as if he had learned from every mistake that had led to his downfall before. But he had not anticipated one thing: the relentless nature of those who pursued him. Undercover operatives orchestrated a controlled interception. Posing as wealthy investors, they arranged a meeting at an exclusive penthouse, claiming to have a business proposition involving high-end microchip distribution. It was a dangerous gamble. If the man was truly Lu, he would not fall for such a simple trap. But if he was growing desperate, if years on the run had begun to wear him down, there was a chance he might make a mistake. The night of the meeting, the operatives arrived at the penthouse, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. The tension was suffocating. Just as they began to suspect he had caught on, the elevator chimed. A single man stepped into the room. His hair was shorter, streaked with gray. His face had aged, the lines more pronounced, but there was no mistaking the sharp intelligence in his eyes. Lu Jianhong had finally surfaced. But as the agents prepared to make their move, something unexpected happened. Lu smiled. It was not the smile of a man who had been caught. It was the smile of someone who had been expecting them. And in that moment, every person in the room realized the truth. Lu had never been running. He had been waiting. The moment stretched longer than it should have. The agents in the penthouse, seasoned professionals who had spent years chasing shadows, felt a sudden shift in control. Lu's smile was subtle, a mere flicker, but it carried weight. It wasn't the expression of a man backed into a corner. It was something else entirely. A warning. In the brief pause that followed, Lu reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, as if testing their reactions. Hands tensed, ready to draw weapons, but the man merely retrieved a small, polished device no larger than a cigarette case. He placed it on the table between them and slid it forward with a casual flick of his fingers. It stopped precisely at the center, catching the light from the chandelier above. "I believe," Lu said in a voice smooth as silk, "this is what you've been looking for." It was the first time he had spoken in nearly a decade, and the sound of it sent an eerie chill through the room. One of the agents hesitated before reaching out, lifting the device carefully. It was sleek, featureless except for a small biometric scanner on its side. No branding, no markings. The kind of technology that didn't officially exist. A silent exchange of glances passed between the team. They knew better than to power it on without proper containment. But Lu, ever the enigma, merely leaned back, clasping his hands together as if amused by their caution. "You have no idea how deep this goes," he continued, his voice almost sympathetic. "All this time, you've been chasing ghosts, unraveling threads that led nowhere. And now, at the end of the road, you still believe you've won." The lead agent narrowed his eyes. "What is this?" Lu exhaled a slow breath, his gaze sweeping across the room. "A key," he said, "but not to the door you think." The air grew heavier, thick with an unseen weight. Outside, the city of Dubai stretched endlessly in the night, its skyline shimmering with impossible wealth. But inside that room, the world was shifting in ways none of them had anticipated, because they had expected to find a fugitive, a criminal clinging to the last remnants of his empire. Instead, they had found something far more dangerous, a man who was still in control. The room remained silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The agents exchanged wary glances, the weight of Lu's words settling heavily upon them. It was a strange sensation, being the ones with the weapons, the authority, the tactical advantage, and yet feeling like the ones who had walked into a trap. One of them finally broke the silence, placing the device into a secure containment pouch. The material was designed to block electromagnetic signals, ensuring whatever was inside couldn't communicate with the outside world. And yet, despite their caution, Lu's smirk deepened ever so slightly, as if he knew something they didn't. "You think you have me," Lu said, his voice still calm, measured. "That's what you've believed all along, isn't it? That if you followed the breadcrumbs, unraveled the web, you'd eventually reach the center and find me sitting here, waiting for you." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "But you never asked the most important question." The lead agent clenched his jaw, trying to maintain control of the situation. "And what's that?" Lu leaned forward just slightly, his gaze sharp. "Who left the breadcrumbs?" For the first time since they had entered the penthouse, uncertainty flickered across the agents' faces. They had been so methodical, so precise in tracking him down. Years of intelligence gathering, surveillance, intercepted messages, all of it had led them here. But what if Lu hadn't simply been running? What if he had been leading them? A slow realization dawned, but before anyone could react, a sharp buzz echoed through the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but in that moment, every nerve in the agents' bodies went on high alert. The containment pouch. The device inside had powered on. Impossible. The agent holding it stiffened, instinctively tightening his grip. But the damage was already done. The biometric scanner had activated on its own, responding to something none of them had accounted for. Lu remained motionless, watching as chaos erupted around him. The agent scrambled to shut it down, barking orders, but it was too late. The lights in the penthouse flickered, then dimmed. And then outside, the entire city of Dubai went dark. For the first time, Lu's expression changed. No longer amused, no longer playing a game. Now, he simply watched as the world reacted to the inevitable. "You thought this was about me," he murmured, almost to himself. "But it was never just about me." The agents were already moving, switching to backup communication channels, scrambling for answers. But deep down they knew. They had never truly caught Lu. Lu had caught them. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the weight of realization. The city's skyline, once alive with the glow of towering skyscrapers, had been reduced to a sea of darkness. A few emergency lights flickered weakly in the distance, but the power grid had collapsed in an instant, as if someone had pulled the plug on an entire civilization. Inside the penthouse, the air had shifted. The agents were no longer in control. They had walked into this room believing they had cornered their target, that they had mapped out every contingency. But now, it was as if the ground beneath them had disappeared, leaving them free-falling into a void of unknowns. Lu remained seated, his face calm, his breathing even. There was no gloating, no arrogance, just the quiet assurance of a man who had seen this moment coming long before anyone else had. The lead agent's radio crackled to life, a burst of static before a voice cut through, strained and panicked. "Command, we've lost all external comms. Power grids are down across the entire region. Traffic control is non-responsive. We are blind." Another voice, this one barely holding on to its composure. "It's not just Dubai. Multiple financial sectors worldwide are reporting simultaneous cyber intrusions. Major stock exchanges are frozen. Satellites are malfunctioning. We don't know how far this reaches." The agent turned sharply to Lu, his hand instinctively gripping the weapon at his side. "What did you do?" Lu exhaled slowly, as if pitying the question itself. "You assumed you were hunting a man," he said, finally rising from his chair. "But men are finite. You can kill a man. You can capture him. You can erase him from history." He took a step forward, the dim light casting long shadows against the wall. "What you can't kill is an idea, a movement, a system." One of the agents reached for his earpiece, whispering urgent commands into the void, but it was useless. There was no response. "I told you," Lu continued, his voice steady. "You never asked the right question." The agent's grip on his weapon tightened. "Who left the breadcrumbs?" Lu smiled. "No." He turned his gaze toward the darkened city outside, the remnants of civilization clinging to the last shreds of order. "The right question," he said softly, "is what happens next?" For the first time in his career, the agent had no answer. The agents stood frozen, their minds racing through every possible scenario, but the truth was clear. There was no turning back. The world had already tipped over the edge, and Lu had simply let gravity do the rest. Somewhere beyond the blacked-out skyline, chaos was unfolding. Banks locked out. Government servers breached. The flow of money, power, and influence severed in ways that would take years, maybe even decades, to untangle. And at the center of it all stood one man who had never needed to pull a trigger or spill a drop of blood to bring empires crumbling down. The lead agent's radio sputtered one last message before cutting to silence. "We've lost. The system is gone." Lou stepped past them, unbothered, walking toward the shattered glass doors that led to the balcony. The night air was thick with an eerie quiet, the kind that came before a storm. He inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of a world that would never be the same again.